So far as the modern monuments of New Paris are concerned, we would gladly be excused from mentioning them. It is not that we do not admire them as they deserve. The Saint Genevieve of M. Soufflot is certainly the finest Savoy cake that has ever been made in stone. The Palace of the Legion of Honor is also a very distinguished bit of pastry. The dome of the Wheat Market is an English jockey cap on a grand scale. The towers of St. Sulpice are two huge clarinets. And the form is as good as any other. The telegraph, contorted and grimacing, forms an admirable accident upon their roofs. Saint Troch has a door which, for magnificence, is comparable only to that of Saint Thomas d'Aquin. It has also a crucifixion in high relief in a cellar, with a sun of gilded wood. These things are fairly marvelous. The lantern of the labyrinth of the Jardin des Plantes is also very ingenious. As for the Palace of the Bourse, which is Greek as to its colonnade, Roman in the round arches of its doors and windows, of the Renaissance by virtue of its flattened vault, it is indubitably a very correct and very pure monument. The proof is that it is crowned with an attic, such as was never seen in Athens, a beautiful, straight line, gracefully broken here and there by stovepipes. Let us add that if it is according to rule that the architecture of a building should be adapted to its purpose in such a manner that this purpose shall be immediately apparent from the mere aspect of the building, one cannot be too much amazed at a structure which might be indifferently the palace of a king, a chamber of communes, a town hall, college, a writing school, an academy, a warehouse, a courthouse, a museum, a barracks, a sepulchre, a temple, or a theater. However, it is an exchange. An edifice ought to be, moreover, suitable to the climate. This one is evidently constructed expressly for our cold and rainy skies. It has a roof almost as flat as roofs in the East, which involves sweeping the roof in winter when it snows, and of course roofs are made to be swept. As for its purpose, of which we just spoke, it fulfills it to a marvel. It is a bourse in France as it would have been a temple in Greece. It is true that the architect was at a good deal of trouble to conceal the clock face, which would have destroyed the purity of the fine lines of the facade. But on the other hand, we have that colonnade which circles round the edifice and under which, on days of high religious ceremony, the theories of the stockbrokers and the courtiers of commerce can be developed so majestically. These are very superb structures. Let us add a quantity of fine, amusing, and varied streets like the Rue de Rivoli, and I do not despair of Paris presenting to the eye, when viewed from a balloon, that richness of line, that opulence of detail, that diversity of aspect, that grandiose something in the simple and unexpected in the beautiful which characterizes a checkerboard. However admirable as the Paris of today may seem to you, reconstruct the Paris of the 15th century, call it up before you in thought, look at the sky athwart that surprising forest of spires, towers, and belfries. Spread out in the center of the city, tear away at the point of the islands, fold at the arches of the bridges, the Seine with its broad green and yellow expanses, more variable than the skin of a serpent. Project clearly against an azure horizon the Gothic profile of this ancient Paris. Make its contour float in a winter's mist which clings to its numerous chimneys. Drown it in profound night and watch the odd play of lights and shadows in that somber labyrinth of edifices. Cast upon it a ray of light which shall vaguely outline it and cause to emerge from the fog the great heads of the towers. Or take that black silhouette again, enliven with shadow the thousand acute angles of the spires and gables, and make it start out more toothed than a shark's jaw against a copper-colored western sky, and then compare. And if you wish to receive of the ancient city an impression with which the modern one can no longer furnish you, climb on the morning of some grand festival, beneath the rising sun of Easter or of Pentecost, climb upon some elevated point, whence you command the entire capital, and be present at the wakening of the chimes. Behold, at a signal given from heaven, for it is the sun which gives it, all those churches quiver simultaneously. First come scattered strokes, running from one church to another, as when musicians give warning that they are about to begin. Then, all at once, behold, for it seems at times as though the ear also possessed a sight of its own, behold, rising from each bell tower, something like a column of sound, a cloud of harmony. First, the vibration of each bell mounts straight upwards, pure and, so to speak, isolated from the others, into the splendid morning sky. Then little by little, as they swell, they melt together, mingle, are lost in each other, and amalgamate in a magnificent concert. It is no longer anything but a mass of sonorous vibrations incessantly sent forth from the numerous belfries, floats, undulates, bounds, whirls over the city, and prolongs far beyond the horizon the deafening circle of its oscillations. Nevertheless, the sea of harmony is not a chaos. Great and profound as it has not lost its transparency. You behold the windings of each group of notes which escapes from the belfries. You can follow the dialogue by turns grave and shrill of the treble and the bass. You can see the octaves leap from one tower to another. You watch them spring forth, winged, light, and whistling from the silver bell to fall, broken and limping from the bell of wood. You admire in their midst the rich gamut which incessantly ascends and reascends the 7 bells of Saint Eustache. You see light and rapid notes running across it, executing 3 or 4 luminous zigzags, and vanishing like flashes of lightning. Yonder is the Abbey of Saint Martin, a shrill, cracked singer. Here the gruff and gloomy voice of the Bastille, at the other end the great tower of the Louvre with its base. The royal chime of the palace scatters on all sides, and without relaxation, resplendent trills, upon which fall, at regular intervals, the heavy strokes from the belfry of Notre-Dame, which makes them sparkle like the anvil under the hammer. At intervals you behold the passage of sounds of all forms which come from the triple peal of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Then, again, from time to time, this mass of sublime noises opens and gives passage to the beats of the Ave Maria, which bursts forth and sparkles like an aigrette of stars. Below, in the very depths of the concert, you confusedly distinguish the interior chanting of the churches, which exhales through the vibrating pores of their vaulted roofs. Assuredly, this is an opera which it is worth the trouble of listening to. Ordinarily, the noise which escapes from Paris by day is the city speaking. By night, it is the city breathing. In this case, it is the city singing. Lend an ear, then, to this concert of bell towers. Spread over all the murmur of 500,000 men, the eternal plaint of the river, the infinite breathings of the wind, the grave and distant quartet of the 4 forests arranged upon the hills on the horizon like immense stacks of organ pipes. Extinguish, as in a half-shade, all that is too hoarse and too shrill about the central chime, and say whether you know anything in the world more rich and joyful, more golden, more dazzling, than this tumult of bells and chimes, than this furnace of music, than these 10,000 brazen voices chanting simultaneously in the flutes of stone, 300 feet high, than this city which is no longer anything but an orchestra, than this symphony which produces the noise of a tempest. Book 4th. Chapter I, Good Souls. 16 years previous to the epoch when this story takes place, one fine morning on Quasimodo Sunday, a living creature had been deposited after Mass in the church of Notre-Dame, on the wooden bed securely fixed in the vestibule on the left, opposite that great image of St. Christopher, which the figure of Messire Antoine des Essarts, Chevalier carved in stone, had been gazing at on his knees since 1413. When they took it into their heads to overthrow the saint and the faithful follower, upon this bed of wood it was customary to expose foundlings for public charity. Whoever cared to take them did so. In front of the wooden bed was a copper basin for alms. The sort of living being which lay upon that plank on the morning of Quasimodo, in the year of the Lord, 1467, appeared to excite to a high degree the curiosity of the numerous group which had congregated about the wooden bed. The group was formed for the most part of the fair sex. Hardly anyone was there except old women. In the first row, and among those who were most bent over the bed, 4 were noticeable, who, from their grey cagoule, a sort of cassock, were recognizable as attached to some devout sisterhood. I do not see why history has not transmitted to posterity the names of these 4 discreet and venerable damsels. They were Agnes la Herme, Jehanne de la Tarme, Henriette la Gaultière, Gauthier la Violette, all 4 widows, all 4 dames of the chapel Etienne Haudry, who had quitted their house with the permission of their mistress, and in conformity with the statutes of Pierre Daly, in order to come and hear the sermon. However, if these good Haudriettes were, for the moment, complying with the statutes of Pierre Daly, they certainly violated with joy those of Michel de Brake and the Cardinal of Pisa, which so inhumanly enjoined silence upon them. "What is this, sister?" said Agnes to Gauthier, gazing at the little creature exposed, which was screaming and writhing on the wooden bed, terrified by so many glances. "What is to become of us," said Jehanne, "if that is the way children are made now?" "I'm not learned in the matter of children," resumed Agnes, "but it must be a sin to look at this one." "'Tis not a child, Agnes. 'Tis an abortion of a monkey," remarked Gauthier. "'Tis a miracle," interposed Henriette la Gaultière. "Then," remarked Agnes, "it is the 3rd since the Sunday of the Lieder, for in less than a week we had the miracle of the mocker of pilgrims divinely punished by Notre-Dame d'Aubervilliers, and that was the 2nd miracle within a month." "This pretended foundling is a real monster of abomination," resumed Jehanne. "He yells loud enough to deafen a chanter," continued Gauthier. "Hold your tongue, you little howler. To think that Monsieur of Rheims sent this enormity to Monsieur of Paris," added la Gaultière, clasping her hands. "I imagine," said Agnes la Herme, "that it is a beast, an animal, the fruit of a Jew and a sow, something not Christian, in short, which ought to be thrown into the fire or into the water." "I really hope," resumed la Gaultière, "that nobody will apply for it." "Ah, good heavens!" exclaimed Agnes, "those poor nurses yonder in the foundling asylum, which forms the lower end of the lane as you go to the river, just beside Monseigneur the Bishop. What if this little monster were to be carried to them to suckle? I'd rather give suck to a vampire. How innocent that poor Laherme is, resumed Jehan. Don't you see, sister, that this little monster is at least 4 years old, and that he would have less appetite for your breast than for a turnspit? Little monster, we should find it difficult ourselves to describe him otherwise, was in fact not a newborn child. It was a very angular and very lively little mass, imprisoned in its linen sack, stamped with the cipher of Messire Guillaume Chartier, then Bishop of Paris, with a head projecting. That head was deformed enough. One beheld only a forest of red hair, one eye, a mouth, and teeth. The eye wept, the mouth cried, and the teeth seemed to ask only to be allowed to bite. The whole struggled in the sack, to the great consternation of the crowd, which increased and was renewed incessantly around it. Dame Elise de Gondelaurier, a rich and noble woman who held by the hand a pretty girl about 5 or 6 years of age, and dragged a long veil about, suspended to the golden horn of her headdress, halted as she passed the wooden bed, and gazed for a moment at the wretched creature, while her charming little daughter, Fleur-de-Lys de Gondelaurier, spelled out with her tiny, pretty finger the permanent inscription attached to the wooden bed: Foundlings. Really, said the dame, turning away in disgust, I thought that they only exposed children here. She turned her back, throwing into the basin a silver florin, which rang among the liards, and made the poor goodwives of the chapel of Etienne Haudry open their eyes. A moment later, the grave and learned Robert Mistrical, the king's protonotary, passed, with an enormous missal under one arm and his wife on the other, Damoiselle Guillemette la Merce, having thus by his side his 2 regulators, spiritual and temporal. Foundling, he said after examining the object, found, apparently, on the banks of the river Phlegethon. One can only see one eye, observed Damoiselle Guillemette. There is a wart on the other. It's not a wart, returned Master Robert Mistrical. It is an egg which contains another demon exactly similar, who bears another little egg which contains another devil, and so on. How do you know that? Asked Guillemette la Merce. I know it pertinently, replied the protonotary. Monsieur le protonotaire, asked Gaucher, what do you prognosticate of this pretended foundling? The greatest misfortunes, replied Mistrical. Ah, good heavens, said an old woman among the spectators, and that besides our having had a considerable pestilence last year, and that they say that the English are going to disembark in a company at Harfleur. Perhaps that will prevent the Queen from coming to Paris in the month of September, interposed another. Trade is so bad already. My opinion is, exclaimed Jehan de la Tarme, that it would be better for the louts of Paris if this little magician were put to bed on a faggot than on a plank. A fine flaming faggot, added the old woman. It would be more prudent, said Mistrical. For several minutes a young priest had been listening to the reasoning of the Haudriettes and the sentences of the notary. He had a severe face, with a large brow, a profound glance. He thrust the crowd silently aside, scrutinized the little magician, and stretched out his hand upon him. It was high time, for all the devotees were already licking their chops over the fine, flaming faggot. I adopt this child, said the priest. He took it in his cassock and carried it off. The spectators followed him with frightened glances. A moment later, he had disappeared through the red door, which then led from the church to the cloister. When the first surprise was over, Jehan de la Tarme bent down to the ear of La Gaultière. I told you so, sister, that young clerk, Monsieur Claude Frollo, is a sorcerer. Chapter II, Claude Frollo. In fact, Claude Frollo was no common person. He belonged to one of those middle-class families which were called indifferently, in the impertinent language of the last century, the high bourgeois or the petty nobility. This family had inherited from the brothers Paclet the fief of Tirechap, which was dependent upon the Bishop of Paris, and whose 21 houses had been in the 13th century the object of so many suits before the official, as possessor of this fief. Claude Frollo was one of the 27 seigneurs keeping claim to a manor in fee in Paris and its suburbs, and for a long time his name was to be seen inscribed in this quality, between the Hôtel de Tancarville, belonging to Master François Lerez, and the College of Tours, in the records deposited at Saint Martin des Champs. Claude Frollo had been destined from infancy by his parents to the ecclesiastical profession. He had been taught to read in Latin, he had been trained to keep his eyes on the ground and to speak low. While still a child, his father had cloistered him in the College of Torquay in the university. There it was that he had grown up, on the Missal and the Lexicon. Moreover, he was a sad, grave, serious child who studied ardently and learned quickly. He never uttered a loud cry in recreation hour, mixed but little in the bacchanals of the Rue du Foire, did not know what it was to dare a lapis at Capillo's Lanire, and had cut no figure in that revolt of 1463, which the annalists register gravely under the title of the Sixth Trouble of the University. He seldom rallied the poor students of Montaigu on the capettes from which they derived their name, or the bursars of the College of Dormans on their shaved tonsure, and their surtout party-colored of bluish-green, blue, and violet cloth, as Urini coloris et bruni, as says the charter of the Cardinal des Quatercurons. On the other hand, he was assiduous at the great and the small schools of the Rue Saint-Jean de Beauvais. The first pupil whom the Abbé de Saint-Pierre de Val, at the moment of beginning his reading on canon law, always perceived, glued to a pillar of the school Saint Vendregesile, opposite his rostrum, was Claude Frollo, armed with his horn-ink bottle, biting his pen, scribbling on his threadbare knee, and in winter, blowing on his fingers. The first auditor whom Messire Miles Disliers, doctor in Decretals, saw arrive every Monday morning, all breathless, at the opening of the gates of the school of the Chef Saint-Denis, was Claude Frollo. Thus, at 16 years of age, the young clerk might have held his own in mystical theology against a father of the Church, in canonical theology against a father of the councils, in scholastic theology against a doctor of Sorbonne. Theology conquered, he had plunged into Decretals. From the master of sentences, he had passed to the capitularies of Charlemagne, and he had devoured in succession in his appetite for science Decretals upon Decretals, those of Theodore, Bishop of Hispalis, those of Bouchard, Bishop of Worms, those of Yves, Bishop of Chartres, next the Decretal of Gratian, which succeeded the Capitularies of Charlemagne, then the collection of Gregory Roman IX, then the Epistle of Superspecula of Honorius Roman III. He rendered clear and familiar to himself that vast and tumultuous period of civil law and canon law in conflict and at strife with each other, in the chaos of the Middle Ages, a period which Bishop Theodore opens in 618, and which Pope Gregory closes in 1227. Decretals digested, he flung himself upon medicine, on the liberal arts. He studied the science of herbs, the science of unguents. He became an expert in fevers and in contusions, in sprains and abscesses. Jacques d'Espars would have received him as a physician, Richard Helene as a surgeon. He also passed through all the degrees of licentiate, master, and doctor of arts. He studied the languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, a triple sanctuary then very little frequented. His was a veritable fever for acquiring and hoarding in the matter of science. At the age of 18, he had made his way through the four faculties. It seemed to the young man that life had but one sole object, learning. It was towards this epoch that the excessive heat of the summer of 1466 caused that grand outburst of the plague which carried off more than 40,000 souls in the Vicomty of Paris, and among others, as Jean de Troyes states, Master Arnauld, astrologer to the king, who was a very fine man, both wise and pleasant. The rumor spread in the university that the Rue Tirechappe was especially devastated by the malady. It was there that Claude's parents resided, in the midst of their fief. The young scholar rushed in great alarm to the paternal mansion. When he entered it, he found that both father and mother had died on the preceding day. A very young brother of his, who was in swaddling clothes, was still alive and crying, abandoned in his cradle. This was all that remained to Claude of his family. The young man took the child under his arm and went off in a pensive mood. Up to that moment, he had lived only in science. He now began to live in life. This catastrophe was a crisis in Claude's existence. Orphaned, the eldest head of the family at the age of 19, he felt himself rudely recalled from the reveries of school to the realities of this world. Then, moved with pity, he was seized with passion and devotion towards that child, his brother. A sweet and strange thing was a human affection to him, who had hitherto loved his books alone. This affection developed to a singular point, in a soul so new it was like a first love. Separated since infancy from his parents whom he had hardly known, cloistered and immured as it were in his books, eager above all things to study and to learn, exclusively attentive up to that time to his intelligence which broadened in science, to his imagination which expanded in letters, the poor scholar had not yet had time to feel the place of his heart. This young brother without mother or father, this little child which had fallen abruptly from heaven into his arms, made a new man of him. He perceived that there was something else in the world besides the speculations of the Sorbonne, and the verses of Homer, that man needed affections, that life without tenderness and without love was only a set of dry, shrieking, and rending wheels. Only he imagined, for he was at the age when illusions are as yet replaced only by illusions, that the affections of blood and family were the sole ones necessary, and that a little brother to love sufficed to fill an entire existence. He threw himself, therefore, into the love for his little Jehan with the passion of a character already profound, ardent, concentrated. That poor frail creature, pretty, fair-haired, rosy, and curly, that orphan with another orphan for his only support, touched him to the bottom of his heart, and grave thinker as he was, he set to meditating upon Jehan with an infinite compassion. He kept watch and ward over him as over something very fragile and very worthy of care. He was more than a brother to the child, he became a mother to him. Little Jehan had lost his mother while he was still at the breast. Claude gave him to a nurse. Besides the fief of Tirechap, he had inherited from his father the fief of Moulin, which was a dependency of the square tower of Gentilly. It was a mill on a hill near the shade of Winchester by Cairder. There was a miller's wife there who was nursing a fine child. It was not far from the university, and Claude carried the little Jehan to her in his own arms. From that time forth, feeling that he had a burden to bear, he took life very seriously. The thought of his little brother became not only his recreation, but the object of his studies. He resolved to consecrate himself entirely to a future for which he was responsible in the sight of God, and never to have any other wife, any other child than the happiness and fortune of his brother. Therefore, he attached himself more closely than ever to the clerical profession. His merits, his learning, his quality of immediate vassal of the Bishop of Paris, threw the doors of the church wide open to him. At the age of 20, by special dispensation of the Holy See, he was a priest, and served as the youngest of the chaplains of Notre-Dame the altar, which is called, because of the late Mass which is said there, Alter Pigrorum. There, plunged more deeply than ever in his dear books, which he quitted only to run for an hour to the fief of Moulin, this mixture of learning and austerity, so rare at his age, had promptly acquired for him the respect and admiration of the monastery. From the cloister, his reputation as a learned man had passed to the people, among whom it had changed a little, a frequent occurrence at that time, into reputation as a sorcerer. It was at the moment when he was returning, on Quasimodo Day, from saying his Mass at the altar of the Lazy, which was by the side of the door leading to the nave on the right, near the image of the Virgin, that his attention had been attracted by the group of old women chattering around the bed for foundlings. Then it was that he approached the unhappy little creature, which was so hated and so menaced. That distress, that deformity, that abandonment, the thought of his young brother, the idea which suddenly occurred to him that if he were to die, his dear little Jehan might also be flung miserably on the plank for foundlings, all this had gone to his heart simultaneously. A great pity had moved in him, and he had carried off the child. When he removed the child from the sack, he found it greatly deformed in very sooth. The poor little wretch had a wart on his left eye, his head placed directly on his shoulders, his spinal column was crooked, his breastbone prominent, and his legs bowed, but he appeared to be lively, and although it was impossible to say in what language he lisped, his cry indicated considerable force and health. Claude's compassion increased at the sight of this ugliness, and he made a vow in his heart to rear the child for the love of his brother, in order that, whatever might be the future faults of the little Jehan, he should have beside him that charity done for his sake. It was a sort of investment of good works which he was effecting in the name of his young brother. It was a stock of good works which he wished to amass in advance for him, in case the little rogue should some day find himself short of that coin, the only sort which is received at the toll bar of paradise. He baptized his adopted child and gave him the name of Quasimodo, either because he desired thereby to mark the day when he had found him, or because he wished to designate by that name to what a degree the poor little creature was incomplete and hardly sketched out. In fact, Quasimodo, blind, hunchbacked, knock-kneed, was only an almost. Chapter Roman 3, Immanis pecoris custos, Immanier ips. Now in 1482, Quasimodo had grown up. He had become a few years previously the bell-ringer of Notre-Dame, thanks to his father by adoption, Claude Frollo, who had become Archdeacon of Josses, thanks to his suzerain, Messire Louis de Beaumont, who had become Bishop of Paris at the death of Guillaume Chardier in 1472, thanks to his patron, Olivier le Dame, barber to Louis Roman XI. King by the grace of God. So Quasimodo was the ringer of the chimes of Notre-Dame. In the course of time there had been formed a certain peculiarly intimate bond which united the ringer to the church. Separated forever from the world, by the double fatality of his unknown birth and his natural deformity, imprisoned from his infancy in that impassable double circle, the poor wretch had grown used to seeing nothing in this world beyond the religious walls which had received him under their shadow. Notre-Dame had been to him successively, as he grew up and developed, the egg, the nest, the house, the country, the universe. There was certainly a sort of mysterious and pre-existing harmony between this creature and this church. When still a little fellow, he had dragged himself tortuously and by jerks beneath the shadows of its vaults. He seemed, with his human face and his bestial limbs, the natural reptile of that humid and somber pavement, upon which the shadow of the Romanesque capitals cast so many strange forms. Later on, the first time that he caught hold mechanically of the ropes to the towers, and hung suspended from them, and set the bell to clanging, it produced upon his adopted father, Claude, the effect of a child whose tongue is unloosed and who begins to speak. It is thus that little by little, developing always in sympathy with the cathedral, living there, sleeping there, hardly ever leaving it, subject every hour to the mysterious impress, he came to resemble it, he encrusted himself in it, so to speak, and became an integral part of it. His salient angles fitted into the retreating angles of the cathedral, if we may be allowed this figure of speech, and he seemed not only its inhabitant, but more than that, its natural tenant. One might almost say that he had assumed its form, as the snail takes on the form of its shell. It was his dwelling, his hole, his envelope. There existed between him and the old church so profound an instinctive sympathy, so many magnetic affinities, so many material affinities, that he adhered to it somewhat as a tortoise adheres to its shell. The rough and wrinkled cathedral was his shell. It is useless to warn the reader not to take literally all the similes which we are obliged to employ here to express the singular, symmetrical, direct, almost consubstantial union of a man and an edifice. It is equally unnecessary to state to what a degree that whole cathedral was familiar to him, after so long and so intimate a cohabitation. That dwelling was peculiar to him. It had no depths to which Quasimodo had not penetrated, no height which he had not scaled. He often climbed many stones up the front, aided solely by the uneven points of the carving. The towers, on whose exterior surface he was frequently seen clambering, like a lizard gliding along a perpendicular wall, those two gigantic twins, so lofty, so menacing, so formidable, possessed for him neither vertigo nor terror, nor shocks of amazement. To see them so gentle under his hand, so easy to scale, one would have said that he had tamed them. By dint of leaping, climbing, gambolling amid the abysses of the gigantic cathedral, he had become, in some sort, a monkey and a goat, like the Calabrian child who swims before he walks, and plays with the sea while still a babe. Moreover, it was not his body alone which seemed fashioned after the cathedral, but his mind also. In what condition was that mind? What bent had it contracted? What form had it assumed beneath that knotted envelope in that savage life? This it would be hard to determine. Quasimodo had been born one-eyed, hunchbacked, lame. It was with great difficulty, and by dint of great patience, that Claude Frollo had succeeded in teaching him to talk. But a fatality was attached to the poor foundling. Bell-ringer of Notre-Dame at the age of 14, a new infirmity had come to complete his misfortunes. The bells had broken the drums of his ears. He had become deaf. The only gate which nature had left wide open for him had been abruptly closed, and forever. In closing, it had cut off the only ray of joy and of light which still made its way into the soul of Quasimodo. His soul fell in profound night. The wretched being's misery became as incurable and as complete as his deformity. Let us add that his deafness rendered him to some extent dumb. For in order not to make others laugh, the very moment that he found himself to be deaf, he resolved upon a silence which he only broke when he was alone. He voluntarily tied that tongue which Claude Frollo had taken so much pains to unloose. Hence it came about that when necessity constrained him to speak, his tongue was torpid, awkward, and like a door whose hinges have grown rusty. If now we were to try to penetrate to the soul of Quasimodo through that thick, hard rind, if we could sound the depths of that badly constructed organism, if it were granted to us to look with a torch behind those non-transparent organs to explore the shadowy interior of that opaque creature, to elucidate his obscure corners, his absurd no-thoroughfares, and suddenly to cast a vivid light upon the soul enchained at the extremity of that cave, we should, no doubt, find the unhappy psyche in some poor, cramped, and rickety attitude, like those prisoners beneath the leads of Venice, who grew old bent double in a stone box which was both too low and too short for them. It is certain that the mind becomes atrophied in a defective body. Quasimodo was barely conscious of a soul cast in his own image, moving blindly within him. The impressions of objects underwent a considerable refraction before reaching his mind. His brain was a peculiar medium. The ideas which passed through it issued forth completely distorted. The reflection which resulted from this refraction was, necessarily, divergent and perverted. Hence 1,000 optical illusions, 1,000 aberrations of judgment, 1,000 deviations, in which his thoughts strayed, now mad, now idiotic. The first effect of this fatal organization was to trouble the glance which he cast upon things. He received hardly any immediate perception of them. The external world seemed much farther away to him than it does to us. The second effect of his misfortune was to render him malicious. He was malicious, in fact, because he was savage. He was savage because he was ugly. There was logic in his nature, as there is in ours. His strength, so extraordinarily developed, was a cause of still greater malevolence. Malice pure robustus, says Hobbes. This justice must, however, be rendered to him. Malevolence was not, perhaps, innate in him. From his very first steps among men he had felt himself, later on he had seen himself, spewed out, blasted, rejected. Human words were for him always a raillery or a malediction. As he grew up he had found nothing but hatred around him. He had caught the general malevolence. He had picked up the weapon with which he had been wounded. After all, he turned his face towards men only with reluctance. His cathedral was sufficient for him. It was peopled with marble figures, kings, saints, bishops, who at least did not burst out laughing in his face and who gazed upon him only with tranquility and kindliness. The other statues, those of the monsters and demons, cherished no hatred for him, Quasimodo. He resembled them too much for that. They seemed rather to be scoffing at other men. The saints were his friends and blessed him. The monsters were his friends and guarded him. So he held long communion with them. He sometimes passed whole hours crouching before one of these statues, in solitary conversation with it. If anyone came, he fled like a lover surprised in his serenade. And the cathedral was not only society for him, but the universe and all nature beside. He dreamed of no other hedgerows than the painted windows, always in flower, no other shade than that of the foliage of stone which spread out, loaded with birds in the tufts of the Saxon capitals, of no other mountains than the colossal towers of the church, of no other ocean than Paris, roaring at their bases. What he loved above all else in the maternal edifice, that which aroused his soul, and made it open its poor wings which it kept so miserably folded in its cavern, that which sometimes rendered him even happy, was the bells. He loved them, fondled them, talked to them, understood them. From the chime in the spire over the intersection of the aisles and nave to the great bell of the front, he cherished a tenderness for them all. The central spire and the two towers were to him as three great cages, whose birds, reared by himself, sang for him alone. Yet it was these very bells which had made him deaf, but mothers often love best that child which has caused them the most suffering. It is true that their voice was the only one which he could still hear. On this score the big bell was his beloved. It was she whom he preferred out of all that family of noisy girls which bustled above him on festival days. This bell was named Marie. She was alone in the southern tower with her sister Jacqueline, a bell of lesser size, shut up in a smaller cage beside hers. This Jacqueline was so called from the name of the wife of Jean Montagu, who had given it to the church, which had not prevented his going and figuring without his head at Montfaucon. In the second tower there were 6 other bells, and finally 6 smaller ones inhabited the belfry over the crossing, with the wooden bell, which rang only between after dinner on Good Friday and the morning of the day before Easter. So Quasimodo had 15 bells in his seraglio, but Big Marie was his favorite. No idea can be formed of his delight on days when the grand peal was sounded. At the moment when the archdeacon dismissed him and said, "Go," he mounted the spiral staircase of the clock tower faster than anyone else could have descended it. He entered perfectly breathless into the aerial chamber of the great bell. He gazed at her a moment, devoutly and lovingly. Then he gently addressed her and patted her with his hand like a good horse, which is about to set out on a long journey. He pitied her for the trouble that she was about to suffer. After these first caresses, he shouted to his assistants, placed in the lower story of the tower, to begin. They grasped the ropes, the wheel creaked, the enormous capsule of metal started slowly into motion. Quasimodo followed it with his glance and trembled. The first shock of the clapper and the brazen wall made the framework upon which it was mounted quiver. Quasimodo vibrated with the bell. "Va!" he cried with a senseless burst of laughter. However, the movement of the base was accelerated, and in proportion as it described a wider angle, Quasimodo's eye opened also more and more widely, phosphoric and flaming. At length the grand peal began. The whole tower trembled. Woodwork, leads, cut stones, all groaned at once, from the piles of the foundation to the trefoils of its summit. Then Quasimodo boiled and frothed. He went and came. He trembled from head to foot with the tower. The bell, furious, running riot, presented to the 2 walls of the tower alternately its brazen throat, whence escaped that tempestuous breath which is audible leagues away. Quasimodo stationed himself in front of this open throat. He crouched and rose with the oscillations of the bell, breathed in this overwhelming breath, gazed by turns at the deep place, which swarmed with people 200 feet below him, and at that enormous, brazen tongue which came, second after second, to howl in his ear. It was the only speech which he understood, the only sound which broke for him the universal silence. He swelled out in it as a bird does in the sun. All of a sudden, the frenzy of the bell seized upon him. His look became extraordinary. He lay in wait for the great bell as it passed, as a spider lies in wait for a fly, and flung himself abruptly upon it with might and main. Then, suspended above the abyss, borne to and fro by the formidable swinging of the bell, he seized the brazen monster by the ear-laps, pressed it between both knees, spurred it on with his heels, and redoubled the fury of the peal with the whole shock and weight of his body. Meanwhile the tower trembled. He shrieked and gnashed his teeth. His red hair rose erect, his breast heaving like a bellows, his eye flashed flames, the monstrous bell neighed, panting beneath him. And then it was no longer the great bell of Notre-Dame nor Quasimodo. It was a dream, a whirlwind, a tempest, dizziness mounted astride of noise. A spirit clinging to a flying crupper, a strange centaur, half man, half bell, a sort of horrible Astolphus, borne away upon a prodigious hippogriff of living bronze. The presence of this extraordinary being caused, as it were, a breath of life to circulate throughout the entire cathedral. It seemed as though there escaped from him, at least according to the growing superstitions of the crowd, a mysterious emanation which animated all the stones of Notre-Dame and made the deep bowels of the ancient church to palpitate. It sufficed for people to know that he was there, to make them believe that they beheld the 1,000 statues of the galleries and the fronts in motion. And the cathedral did indeed seem a docile and obedient creature beneath his hand. It waited on his will to raise its great voice. It was possessed and filled with Quasimodo, as with a familiar spirit. One would have said that he made the immense edifice breathe. He was everywhere about it. In fact, he multiplied himself on all points of the structure. Now one perceived with affright at the very top of one of the towers, a fantastic dwarf climbing, writhing, crawling on all fours, descending outside above the abyss, leaping from projection to projection, and going to ransack the belly of some sculptured gorgon. It was Quasimodo dislodging the crows. Again, in some obscure corner of the church, one came in contact with a sort of living chimera, crouching and scowling. It was Quasimodo engaged in thought. Sometimes one caught sight, upon a bell tower, of an enormous head, and a bundle of disordered limbs swinging furiously at the end of a rope. It was Quasimodo ringing vespers, or the Angelus. Often at night a hideous form was seen wandering along the frail balustrade of carved lacework, which crowns the towers and borders the circumference of the apse. Again it was the Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Then, said the women of the neighborhood, the whole church took on something fantastic, supernatural, horrible. Eyes and mouths were opened here and there. One heard the dogs, the monsters, and the gargoyles of stone, which keep watch night and day with outstretched neck and open jaws. Around the monstrous cathedral, barking, and if it was a Christmas Eve, while the great bell, which seemed to emit the death rattle, summoned the faithful to the midnight mass, such an air was spread over the somber facade that one would have declared that the grand portal was devouring the throng, and that the rose window was watching it. And all this came from Quasimodo. Egypt would have taken him for the god of this temple. The Middle Ages believed him to be its demon. He was in fact its soul. To such an extent was this disease that for those who know that Quasimodo has existed, Notre Dame is today deserted, inanimate, dead. One feels that something has disappeared from it. That immense body is empty. It is a skeleton. The spirit has quitted it. One sees its place, and that is all. It is like a skull which still has holes for the eyes, but no longer sight. Chapter Roman 4, The Dog and His Master. Nevertheless, there was one human creature whom Quasimodo accepted from his malice and from his hatred for others, and whom he loved even more, perhaps, than his cathedral. This was Claude Frollo. The matter was simple. Claude Frollo had taken him in, had adopted him, had nourished him, had reared him. When a little lad, it was between Claude Frollo's legs that he was accustomed to seek refuge, when the dogs and the children barked after him. Claude Frollo had taught him to talk, to read, to write. Claude Frollo had finally made him the bell ringer. Now, to give the big bell in marriage to Quasimodo was to give Juliet to Romeo. Hence Quasimodo's gratitude was profound, passionate, boundless, and although the visage of his adopted father was often clouded or severe, although his speech was habitually curt, harsh, imperious, that gratitude never wavered for a single moment. The archdeacon had in Quasimodo the most submissive slave, the most docile lackey, the most vigilant of dogs. When the poor bell-ringer became deaf, there had been established between him and Claude Frollo a language of signs, mysterious and understood by themselves alone. In this manner the archdeacon was the sole human being with whom Quasimodo had preserved communication. He was in sympathy with but two things in this world, Notre Dame and Claude Frollo. There is nothing which can be compared with the empire of the archdeacon over the bell-ringer, with the attachment of the bell-ringer for the archdeacon. A sign from Claude and the idea of giving him pleasure would have sufficed to make Quasimodo hurl himself headlong from the summit of Notre Dame. It was a remarkable thing, all that physical strength which had reached in Quasimodo such an extraordinary development, and which was placed by him blindly at the disposition of another. There was in it, no doubt, filial devotion, domestic attachment. There was also the fascination of one spirit by another spirit. It was a poor, awkward, and clumsy organization which stood with lowered head and supplicating eyes before a lofty and profound, a powerful and superior intellect. Lastly, and above all, it was gratitude. Gratitude so pushed to its extremest limit that we do not know to what to compare it. This virtue is not one of those of which the finest examples are to be met with among men. We will say, then, that Quasimodo loved the archdeacon as never a dog, never a horse, never an elephant loved his master. Chapter V. More about Claude Frollo. In 1482, Quasimodo was about 20 years of age, Claude Frollo about 36. One had grown up, the other had grown old. Claude Frollo was no longer the simple scholar of the College of Torquay, the tender protector of a little child. the young and dreamy philosopher who knew many things and was ignorant of many. He was a priest, austere, grave, morose, one charged with souls, Monsieur the Archdeacon of Josas, the bishop's second acolyte, having charge of the 2 deaneries of Montlhéry and Châteaufort and 174 country curacies. He was an imposing and somber personage, before whom the choir boys in alb and in jacket trembled, as well as the Machicots 25, and the brothers of Saint Augustine and the matinal clerks of Notre-Dame, when he passed slowly beneath the lofty arches of the choir, majestic, thoughtful, with arms folded, and his head so bent upon his breast that all one saw of his face was his large, bold brow. Dom Claude Frollo had, however, abandoned neither science nor the education of his young brother, those 2 occupations of his life. But as time went on, some bitterness had been mingled with these things which were so sweet. In the long run, says Paul Diaker, the best lard turns rancid. Little Jehan Frollo, surnamed Dumoulin of the Mill because of the place where he had been reared, had not grown up in the direction which Claude would have liked to impose upon him. The big brother counted upon a pious, docile, learned, and honorable pupil. But the little brother, like those young trees which deceive the gardener's hopes and turn obstinately to the quarter whence they receive sun and air, the little brother did not grow and did not multiply, but only put forth fine, bushy, and luxuriant branches on the side of laziness, ignorance, and debauchery. He was a regular devil, and a very disorderly one who made Dom Claude scowl, but very droll and very subtle, which made the big brother smile. Claude had confided him to that same college of Torquay where he had passed his early years in study and meditation, and it was a grief to him that this sanctuary, formerly edified by the name of Frollo, should today be scandalized by it. He sometimes preached Jehan very long and severe sermons, which the latter intrepidly endured. After all, the young scapegrace had a good heart, as can be seen in all comedies, but the sermon over, he none the less tranquilly resumed his course of seditions and enormities. Now it was a bay John or yellow beak, as they called the new arrivals at the university, whom he had been mauling by way of welcome, a precious tradition which has been carefully preserved to our own day. Again he had set in movement a band of scholars who had flung themselves upon a wine shop in classic fashion, quasi-classico excitati, had then beaten the tavern keeper with offensive cudgels, and joyously pillaged the tavern, even to smashing in the hogsheads of wine in the cellar. And then it was a fine report in Latin, which the sub-monitor of Torquay carried piteously to Dom Claude with this dolorous marginal comment, Rixa, prima causa vinum optimum potatum. Finally, it was said, a thing quite horrible in a boy of 16, that his debauchery often extended as far as the Rue de Gladigny. Claude, saddened and discouraged in his human affections by all this, had flung himself eagerly into the arms of learning, that sister which, at least, does not laugh in your face, and which always pays you, though in money that is sometimes a little hollow, for the attention which you have paid to her. Hence he became more and more learned, and at the same time, as a natural consequence, more and more rigid as a priest, more and more sad as a man. There are for each of us several parallelisms between our intelligence, our habits, and our character, which develop without a break, and break only in the great disturbances of life. As Claude Frollo had passed through nearly the entire circle of human learning, positive, exterior, and permissible since his youth, he was obliged, unless he came to a halt ubi defuit orbis, to proceed further and seek other aliments for the insatiable activity of his intelligence. The antique symbol of the serpent biting its tail is above all applicable to science. It would appear that Claude Frollo had experienced this. Many grave persons affirm that, after having exhausted the facts of human learning, he had dared to penetrate into the nefas. He had, they said, tasted in succession all the apples of the tree of knowledge, and whether from hunger or disgust, had ended by tasting the forbidden fruit. He had taken his place by turns, as the reader has seen, in the conferences of the theologians in Sorbonne, in the assemblies of the doctors of art, after the manner of Saint Hilaire in the disputes of the decretalists, after the manner of Saint Martin in the congregations of physicians at the holy water font of Notre-Dame, ad cupem nostri Domini. All the dishes permitted and approved, which those 4 great kitchens called the 4 faculties could elaborate and serve to the understanding, he had devoured, and had been satiated with them before his hunger was appeased. Then he had penetrated further, lower, beneath all that finished, material, limited knowledge. He had, perhaps, risked his soul, and had seated himself in the cavern at that mysterious table of the alchemists, of the astrologers, of the hermetics, of which Averroes, Guillaume de Paris, and Nicolas Flamel hold the end in the Middle Ages, and which extends in the east by the light of the 7-branched candlestick to Solomon, Pythagoras, and Zoroaster. That is at least what was supposed, whether rightly or not. It is certain that the archdeacon often visited the cemetery of the Saints Innocents, where, it is true, his father and mother had been buried, with other victims of the plague of 1466, but that he appeared far less devout before the cross of their grave than before the strange figures with which the tomb of Nicolas Flamel and Claude Pernelle, erected just beside it, was loaded. It is certain that he had frequently been seen to pass along the Rue des Lombards, and furtively enter a little house which formed the corner of the Rue des Écrivains and the Rue Marival. It was the house which Nicolas Flamel had built where he had died about 1417, and which, constantly deserted since that time, had already begun to fall in ruins, so greatly had the hermetics and the alchemists of all countries wasted away the walls, merely by carving their names upon them. Some neighbors even affirmed that they had once seen, through an air hole, Archdeacon Claude excavating, turning over, digging up the earth in the two cellars, whose supports had been daubed with numberless couplets and hieroglyphics by Nicolas Flamel himself. It was supposed that Flamel had buried the philosopher's stone in the cellar, and the alchemists, for the space of 2 centuries, from Magistry to Father Pacifique, never ceased to worry the soil until the house, so cruelly ransacked and turned over, ended by falling into dust beneath their feet. Again, it is certain that the archdeacon had been seized with a singular passion for the symbolical door of Notre-Dame, that page of a conjuring book written in stone, by Bishop Guillaume de Paris, who has no doubt been damned for having affixed so infernal a frontispiece to the sacred poem chanted by the rest of the edifice. Archdeacon Claude had the credit also of having fathomed the mystery of the Colossus of St. Christopher, and of that lofty, enigmatical statue which then stood at the entrance of the vestibule, and which the people in derision called Monsieur Legris. But what everyone might have noticed was the interminable hours which he often employed, seated upon the parapet of the area in front of the church, in contemplating the sculptures of the front, examining now the foolish virgins with their lamps reversed, now the wise virgins with their lamps upright, again calculating the angle of vision of that raven which belongs to the left front, and which is looking at a mysterious point inside the church, where is concealed the philosopher's stone, if it be not in the cellar of Nicolas Flamel. It was, let us remark in passing, a singular fate for the church of Notre Dame at that epoch to be so beloved, in 2 different degrees and with so much devotion, by 2 beings so dissimilar as Claude and Quasimodo. Beloved by one, a sort of instinctive and savage half-man, for its beauty, for its stature, for the harmonies which emanated from its magnificent ensemble. Beloved by the other, a learned and passionate imagination, for its myth, for the sense which it contains, for the symbolism scattered beneath the sculptures of its front, like the first text underneath the second in a palimpsest, in a word, for the enigma which it is eternally propounding to the understanding. Furthermore, it is certain that the archdeacon had established himself in that one of the 2 towers which looks upon the Greve, just beside the frame for the bells, a very secret little cell, into which no one, not even the bishop, entered without his leave, it was said. This tiny cell had formerly been made almost at the summit of the tower among the ravens' nests by Bishop Hugo de Besançon 26, who had wrought sorcery there in his day. What that cell contained, no one knew. But from the strand of the terrain at night there was often seen to appear, disappear, and reappear at brief and regular intervals, a little dormer window opening upon the back of the tower, a certain red, intermittent, singular light which seemed to follow the panting breaths of a bellows, and to proceed from a flame rather than from a light. In the darkness at that height it produced a singular effect, and the goodwives said, "There's the archdeacon blowing, hell is sparkling up yonder." There were no great proofs of sorcery in that after all, but there was still enough smoke to warrant a surmise of fire, and the archdeacon bore a tolerably formidable reputation. We ought to mention, however, that the sciences of Egypt, that necromancy and magic, even the widest, even the most innocent, had no more envenomed enemy, no more pitiless denunciator before the gentlemen of the officialty of Notre Dame, whether this was sincere horror, or the game played by the thief who shouts, "Stop, thief." At all events, it did not prevent the archdeacon from being considered by the learned heads of the chapter as a soul who had ventured into the vestibule of hell, who was lost in the caves of the cabal, groping amid the shadows of the occult sciences. Neither were the people deceived thereby. With anyone who possessed any sagacity, Quasimodo passed for the demon, Claude Frollo for the sorcerer. It was evident that the bellringer was to serve the archdeacon for a given time, at the end of which he would carry away the latter's soul by way of payment. Thus the archdeacon, in spite of the excessive austerity of his life, was in bad odor among all pious souls, and there was no devout nose so inexperienced that it could not smell him out to be a magician. And if as he grew older abysses had formed in his science, they had also formed in his heart. That at least is what one had grounds for believing on scrutinizing that face upon which the soul was only seen to shine through a somber cloud, whence that large, bold brow, that head forever bent, that breast always heaving with sighs. What secret thought caused his mouth to smile with so much bitterness? At the same moment that his scowling brows approached each other like 2 bulls on the point of fighting, why was what hair he had left already gray? What was that internal fire which sometimes broke forth in his glance, to such a degree that his eye resembled a hole pierced in the wall of a furnace? These symptoms of a violent moral preoccupation had acquired an especially high degree of intensity at the epoch when this story takes place. More than once a choir boy had fled in terror at finding him alone in the church, so strange and dazzling was his look. More than once in the choir at the hour of the offices, his neighbor in the stalls had heard him mingle with the plain song, ad omnem tonum, unintelligible parentheses. More than once the laundress of the terrain charged with washing the chapter had observed, not without affright, the marks of nails and clenched fingers on the surplice of Monsieur the Archdeacon of Joses. However, he redoubled his severity and had never been more exemplary. By profession as well as by character, he had always held himself aloof from women. He seemed to hate them more than ever. The mere rustling of a silken petticoat caused his hood to fall over his eyes. Upon this score he was so jealous of austerity and reserve that when the Dame de Beaujeu, the king's daughter, came to visit the cloister of Notre-Dame in the month of December 1481, he gravely opposed her entrance, reminding the bishop of the statute of the Black Book, dating from the vigil of Saint Barthélemy, 1334, which interdicts access to the cloister to any woman whatever, old or young, mistress or maid. Upon which the bishop had been constrained to recite to him the ordinance of Legate Odo, which accepts certain great dames, aliqui magnates mulieres, qui sine scandalo vitari non possent. And again the archdeacon had protested, objecting that the ordinance of the legate, which dated back to 1207, was anterior by 127 years to the Black Book, and consequently was abrogated in fact by it. And he had refused to appear before the princess. It was also noticed that his horror for bohemian women and gypsies had seemed to redouble for some time past. He had petitioned the bishop for an edict which expressly forbade the bohemian women to come and dance and beat their tambourines on the place of the parvis, and for about the same length of time he had been ransacking the moldy placards of the officially, in order to collect the cases of sorcerers and witches condemned to fire or the rope for complicity in crimes with rams, sows or goats. Chapter VI. Unpopularity. The archdeacon and the bellringer, as we have already said, were but little loved by the populace great and small in the vicinity of the cathedral. When Claude and Quasimodo went out together, which frequently happened, and when they were seen traversing in company, the valet behind the master, the cold, narrow, and gloomy streets of the block of Notre-Dame, more than one evil word, more than one ironical quaver, more than one insulting jest greeted them on their way. Unless Claude Frollo, which was rarely the case, walked with head upright and raised, showing his severe and almost august brow to the dumbfounded jeerers. Both were in their quarter like the poets of whom Regnier speaks. All sorts of persons run after poets, as warblers fly shrieking after owls. Sometimes a mischievous child risked his skin and bones for the ineffable pleasure of driving a pin into Quasimodo's hump. Again, a young girl, more bold and saucy than was fitting, brushed the priest's black robe, singing in his face the sardonic ditty, "Nitch, nitch, the devil is caught." Sometimes a group of squalid old crones, squatting in a file under the shadow of the steps to a porch, scolded noisily as the archdeacon and the bellringer passed, and tossed them this encouraging welcome with a curse. There's a fellow whose soul is made like the other one's body. Or a band of schoolboys and street urchins playing hopscotch rose in a body and saluted him classically with some cry in Latin, "Aya, aya, Claudius cum Claudo." But the insult generally passed unnoticed both by the priest and the bellringer. Quasimodo was too deaf to hear all these gracious things, and Claude was too dreamy. Book 5. Chapter I. Abba's Beatty Martini. Dom Claude's fame had spread far and wide. It procured for him, at about the epoch when he refused to see Madame de Beaujeu, a visit which he long remembered. It was in the evening. He had just retired after the office to his canon's cell in the cloister of Notre-Dame. This cell, with the exception possibly of some glass phials relegated to a corner and filled with a decidedly equivocal powder which strongly resembled the alchemist's powder of projection, presented nothing strange or mysterious. There were indeed, here and there, some inscriptions on the walls, but they were pure sentences of learning and piety, extracted from good authors. The archdeacon had just seated himself, by the light of a three-jetted copper lamp, before a vast coffer crammed with manuscripts. He had rested his elbow upon the open volume of Honorius Dautin, De Predestination et Libero Arbitrio, and he was turning over in deep meditation the leaves of a printed folio which he had just brought, the sole product of the press which his cell contained. In the midst of his reverie there came a knock at his door. "Who's there?" cried the learned man in the gracious tone of a famished dog disturbed over his bone. A voice without replied, "Your friend, Jacques Coictier." He went to open the door. It was, in fact, the king's physician, a person about 50 years of age, whose harsh physiognomy was modified only by a crafty eye. Another man accompanied him. Both wore long slate-colored robes, furred with minever, girded and closed with caps of the same stuff and hue. Their hands were concealed by their sleeves, their feet by their robes, their eyes by their caps. "God help me, messieurs," said the archdeacon, showing them in. "I was not expecting distinguished visitors at such an hour." And while speaking in this courteous fashion, he cast an uneasy and scrutinizing glance from the physician to his companion. "'Tis never too late to come and pay a visit to so considerable a learned man as Dom Claude Frollo de Tirechep," replied Dr. Coictier, whose French Comté accent made all his phrases drag along with the majesty of a train robe. There then ensued between the physician and the archdeacon one of those congratulatory prologues which, in accordance with custom, at that epoch preceded all conversations between learned men, and which did not prevent them from detesting each other in the most cordial manner in the world. However, it is the same nowadays. Every wise man's mouth complimenting another wise man is a vase of honeyed gall. Claude Frollo's felicitations to Jacques Coictier bore reference principally to the temporal advantages which the worthy physician had found means to extract, in the course of his much-envied career, from each malady of the king, an operation of alchemy much better and more certain than the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. "In truth, Monsieur le Docteur Coictier, I felt great joy on learning of the bishopric given your nephew, my reverend Seigneur Pierre Versailles. Is he not Bishop of Amiens?" "Yes, Monsieur Archdeacon, it is a grace and mercy of God." "Do you know that you made a great figure on Christmas Day at the head of your company of the Chamber of Accounts, Monsieur President?" "Vice President Dom Claude, alas, nothing more." "How is your superb house in the Rue Saint-André des Arcs coming on? 'Tis a Louvre. I love greatly the apricot tree which is carved on the door with this play of words, a l'abricotier sheltered from reefs." "Alas, Master Claude, all that masonry costeth me dear. In proportion as the house is erected, I am ruined." "Ho, have you not your revenues from the jail and the bailiwick of the palais and the rents of all the houses, sheds, stalls, and booths of the enclosure? 'Tis a fine breast to suck." "My castellany of Poissy has brought me in nothing this year." "But your tolls of trial, of St. James, of St. Germain-en-Laye are always good." 60 livres, and not even Parisian livres at that." "You have your office of counselor to the king, that is fixed." "Yes, brother Claude, but that accursed seigneury of Poligny, which people make so much noise about, is worth not 60 gold crowns, year out and year in." In the compliments which Dom Claude addressed to Jacques Coictier, there was that sardonical, biting, and covertly mocking accent, and the sad, cruel smile of a superior and unhappy man who toys for a moment, by way of distraction, with the dense prosperity of a vulgar man. The other did not perceive it. "Upon my soul," said Claude at length, pressing his hand, "I am glad to see you and in such good health." "Thanks, Master Claude." "By the way," exclaimed Dom Claude, "how is your royal patient?" "He payeth not sufficiently his physician," replied the doctor, casting a side glance at his companion. "Think you so, gossip Coictier?" said the latter. These words, uttered in a tone of surprise and reproach, drew upon this unknown personage the attention of the archdeacon, which, to tell the truth, had not been diverted from him a single moment since the stranger had set foot across the threshold of his cell. It had even required all the 1,000 reasons which he had for handling tenderly Dr. Jacques Coictier, the all-powerful physician of King Louis Roman XI, to induce him to receive the latter thus accompanied. Hence, there was nothing very cordial in his manner when Jacques Coictier said to him, "By the way, Dom Claude, I bring you a colleague who has desired to see you on account of your reputation." "Monsieur belongs to science?" asked the archdeacon, fixing his piercing eye upon Coictier's companion. He found beneath the brows of the stranger a glance no less piercing or less distrustful than his own. He was, so far as the feeble light of the lamp permitted one to judge, an old man about 60 years of age and of medium stature, who appeared somewhat sickly and broken in health. His profile, although of a very ordinary outline, had something powerful and severe about it. His eyes sparkled beneath a very deep superciliary arch, like a light in the depths of a cave, and beneath his cap, which was well drawn down and fell upon his nose, one recognized the broad expanse of a brow of genius. He took it upon himself to reply to the archdeacon's question. "Reverend Master," he said in a grave tone, "your renown has reached my ears, and I wish to consult you. I am but a poor provincial gentleman who removeth his shoes before entering the dwellings of the learned. You must know my name. I am called Gossip Tourangeau." "Strange name for a gentleman," said the archdeacon to himself. Nevertheless, he had a feeling that he was in the presence of a strong and earnest character. The instinct of his own lofty intellect made him recognize an intellect no less lofty under Gossip Turinjo's furred cap, and as he gazed at the solemn face, the ironical smile which Jacques Coictier's presence called forth on his gloomy face gradually disappeared as twilight fades on the horizon of night. Stern and silent, he had resumed his seat in his great armchair. His elbow rested as usual on the table and his brow on his hand. After a few moments of reflection, he motioned his visitors to be seated, and turning to Gossip Turinjo, he said, "You come to consult me, master, and upon what science?" "Your reverence," replied Turinjo, "I am ill, very ill. You are said to be great Aesculapius, and I am come to ask your advice in medicine." "Medicine," said the archdeacon, tossing his head. He seemed to meditate for a moment and then resumed, "Gossip Turinjo, since that is your name, turn your head. You will find my reply already written on the wall." Gossip Turinjo obeyed, and read this inscription engraved above his head: "Medicine is the daughter of dreams, Jamblique." Meanwhile, Dr. Jacques Coictier had heard his companion's question with a displeasure which Dom Claude's response had but redoubled. He bent down to the ear of Gossip Turinjo and said to him, softly enough not to be heard by the archdeacon, "I warned you that he was mad. You insisted on seeing him." "'Tis very possible that he is right, madman as he is, Dr. Jacques," replied his comrade in the same low tone and with a bitter smile. "As you please," replied Coictier dryly. Then addressing the archdeacon, "You are clever at your trade, Dom Claude, and you are no more at a loss over Hippocrates than a monkey is over a nut. Medicine a dream. I suspect that the pharmacopolists and the master physicians would insist upon stoning you if they were here. So you deny the influence of filters upon the blood and unguents on the skin. You deny that eternal pharmacy of flowers and metals, which is called the world, made expressly for that eternal invalid called man." "I deny," said Dom Claude coldly, "neither pharmacy nor the invalid. I reject the physician." "Then it is not true," resumed Coictier hotly, "that gout is an internal eruption, that a wound caused by artillery is to be cured by the application of a young mouse roasted, that young blood, properly injected, restores youth to aged veins. It is not true that 2 and 2 make 4, and that improstathonos follows opistathonos." The archdeacon replied without perturbation, "There are certain things of which I think in a certain fashion." Coictier became crimson with anger. There, my good Coictier, let us not get angry," said Gossip Turinjo. "Monsieur the Archdeacon is our friend." Coictier calmed down, muttering in a low tone, "After all, he's mad." "Pastia, Master Claude," resumed Gossip Turinjo after a silence, "you embarrass me greatly. I had 2 things to consult you upon, one touching my health and the other touching my star." "Monsieur," returned the archdeacon, "if that be your motive, you would have done as well not to put yourself out of breath climbing my staircase. I do not believe in medicine. I do not believe in astrology." "Indeed," said the man with surprise. Coictier gave a forced laugh. "You see that he is mad," he said in a low tone to Gossip Turinjo. "He does not believe in astrology." "The idea of imagining," pursued Dom Claude, "that every ray of a star is a thread which is fastened to the head of a man." "And what then do you believe in?" exclaimed Gossip Turinjo. The archdeacon hesitated for a moment, then he allowed a gloomy smile to escape, which seemed to give the lie to his response. "Credo in diem." "Dominum nostrum," added Gossip Turinjo, making the sign of the cross. "Amen," said Coictier. "Reverend Master," resumed Turinjo, "I am charmed in soul to see you in such a religious frame of mind. But have you reached the point, great savant as you are, of no longer believing in science?" "No," said the archdeacon, grasping the arm of Gossip Turinjo, and a ray of enthusiasm lighted up his gloomy eyes. "No, I do not reject science. I have not crawled so long flat on my belly with my nails in the earth, through the innumerable ramifications of its caverns, without perceiving far in front of me, at the end of the obscure gallery, a light, a flame, a something, the reflection, no doubt, of the dazzling central laboratory, where the patient and the wise have found out God." "And in short," interrupted Turinjo, "what do you hold to be true and certain?" "Alchemy." Coictier exclaimed, "Pardieu, Dom Claude, alchemy has its use, no doubt, but why blaspheme medicine and astrology?" "Naught is your science of man, naught is your science of the stars," said the archdeacon commandingly. "That's driving Epidaurus and Chaldea very fast," replied the physician with a grin. "Listen, Messire Jacques, this is said in good faith. I am not the king's physician, and his majesty has not given me the garden of Daedalus in which to observe the constellations. Don't get angry, but listen to me. What truth have you deduced? I will not say from medicine, which is too foolish a thing, but from astrology. Cite to me the virtues of the vertical Boustrafetin, the treasures of the number Zeruf, and those of the number Zephirot. Will you deny, said Coactier, the sympathetic force of the collarbone and the cabalistics which are derived from it? An error, Messire Jacques. None of your formulas end in reality. Alchemy, on the other hand, has its discoveries. Will you contest results like this? Ice confined beneath the earth for 1,000 years is transformed into rock crystals. Lead is the ancestor of all metals, for gold is not a metal, gold is light. Lead requires only 4 periods of 200 years each to pass in succession from the state of lead to the state of red arsenic, from red arsenic to tin. From tin to silver. Are not these facts? But to believe in the collarbone, in the full line, and in the stars is as ridiculous as to believe with the inhabitants of Grand Cathay that the golden oriole turns into a mole, and that grains of wheat turn into fish of the carp species. I have studied hermetic science, exclaimed Coactier, and I affirm. The fiery archdeacon did not allow him to finish. And I have studied medicine, astrology, and hermetics. Here alone is the truth. As he spoke thus, he took from the top of the coffer a phial filled with the powder which we have mentioned above. Here alone is light. Hippocrates is a dream. Urania is a dream. Hermes a thought. Gold is the sun. To make gold is to be God. Herein lies the one and only science. I have sounded the depths of medicine and astrology. I tell you naught, nothingness, the human body, shadows, the planets, shadows. And he fell back in his armchair in a commanding and inspired attitude. Gossip Turrejo watched him in silence. Coactier tried to grin, shrugged his shoulders imperceptibly, and repeated in a low voice, "The madman." And said Turrejo suddenly, "The wondrous result, have you attained it? Have you made gold?" "If I had made it," replied the archdeacon, articulating his words slowly, like a man who is reflecting, "the King of France would be named Claude and not Louis." The stranger frowned. "What am I saying?" resumed Dom Claude with a smile of disdain. "What would the throne of France be to me when I could rebuild the empire of the Orient?" "Very good," said the stranger. "Oh, the poor fool," murmured Coactier. The archdeacon went on, appearing to reply now only to his thoughts. "But no, I am still crawling. I am scratching my face and knees against the pebbles of the subterranean pathway. I catch a glimpse, I do not contemplate, I do not read, I spell out." "And when you know how to write," demanded the stranger, "will you make gold?" "Who doubts it?" said the archdeacon. "In that case Our Lady knows that I am greatly in need of money, and I should much desire to read in your books. Tell me, reverend master, is your science inimical or displeasing to Our Lady?" "Whose archdeacon I am," Dom Claude contented himself with replying with tranquil hauteur. "That is true, my master. Well, will it please you to initiate me? Let me spell with you." Claude assumed the majestic and pontifical attitude of a Samuel. "Old man, it requires longer years than remain to you to undertake this voyage across mysterious things. Your head is very gray. One comes forth from the cavern only with white hair, but only those with dark hair enter it. Science alone knows well how to hollow, wither, and dry up human faces. She needs not to have old age bring her faces already furrowed. Nevertheless, if the desire possesses you of putting yourself under discipline at your age, and of deciphering the formidable alphabet of the sages, come to me. 'Tis well, I will make the effort. I will not tell you, poor old man, to go and visit the sepulchral chambers of the pyramids, of which ancient Herodotus speaks, nor the brick tower of Babylon, nor the immense white marble sanctuary of the Indian temple of Eklinga. I, no more than yourself, have seen the Chaldean masonry works constructed according to the sacred form of the Sikra, nor the temple of Solomon, which is destroyed, nor the stone doors of the sepulchre of the kings of Israel, which are broken. We will content ourselves with the fragments of the book of Hermes which we have here. I will explain to you the statue of Saint Christopher, the symbol of the sower, and that of the 2 angels which are on the front of the Saint Chapelle, and one of which holds in his hands a vase, the other a cloud." Here Jacques Coactier, who had been unhorsed by the archdeacon's impetuous replies, regained his saddle, and interrupted him with the triumphant tone of one learned man correcting another. "Eras amis Claudi. The symbol is not the number. You take Orpheus for Hermes." "'Tis you who are in error," replied the archdeacon gravely. "Daedalus is the base, Orpheus is the wall, Hermes is the edifice, that is all. You shall come when you will," he continued, turning to Turrejo. "I will show you the little parcels of gold which remained at the bottom of Nicolas Flamel's alembic, and you shall compare them with the gold of Guillaume de Paris. I will teach you the secret virtues of the Greek word peristera, but first of all I will make you read." One after the other, the marble letters of the alphabet, the granite pages of the book. We shall go to the portal of Bishop Guillaume and of Saint Jean Le Rond at the Sainte-Chapelle, then to the house of Nicolas Flamel, Rue Manvault, to his tomb, which is at the Saints Innocents, to his 2 hospitals, Rue de Montmorency. I will make you read the hieroglyphics which cover the 4 great iron cramps on the portal of the Hospital Saint Gervais and of the Rue de la Ferronnerie. We will spell out in company, also, the facade of Saint Come, of Saint Geneviève des Ardents, of Saint Martin, of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie. For a long time, gossip Tourangeau, intelligent as was his glance, had appeared not to understand Dom Claude. He interrupted. Pasque, what are your books, then? Here is one of them, said the archdeacon. And opening the window of his cell, he pointed out with his finger the immense church of Notre-Dame, which, outlining against the starry sky the black silhouette of its 2 towers, its stone flanks, its monstrous haunches, seemed an enormous 2-headed sphinx, seated in the middle of the city. The archdeacon gazed at the gigantic edifice for some time in silence, then extending his right hand with a sigh towards the printed book which lay open on the table, and his left towards Notre-Dame, and turning a sad glance from the book to the church, alas, he said, this will kill that. Coictier, who had eagerly approached the book, could not repress an exclamation. Hey, but now, what is there so formidable in this? Glossa in Epistolas D. Pauli Norimbergi Antonius Coburger 1474. This is not new, 'tis a book of Pierre Lombard, the master of sentences. Is it because it is printed? You have said it, replied Claude, who seemed absorbed in a profound meditation and stood resting, his forefinger bent backward on the folio which had come from the famous press of Nuremberg. Then he added these mysterious words, Alas, alas, small things come at the end of great things, a tooth triumphs over a mass. The Nile rat kills the crocodile, the swordfish kills the whale, the book will kill the edifice. The curfew of the cloister sounded at the moment when Master Jacques was repeating to his companion in low tones his eternal refrain, he is mad, to which his companion this time replied, I believe that he is. It was the hour when no stranger could remain in the cloister. The 2 visitors withdrew. Master, said gossip Tourangeau as he took leave of the archdeacon, I love wise men and great minds, and I hold you in singular esteem. Come tomorrow to the Palace des Tournelles and inquire for the Abbé de Saint Martin of Tours. The archdeacon returned to his chamber dumbfounded, comprehending at last who gossip Tourangeau was, and recalling that passage of the Register of Saint Martin of Tours, Abbas Bedi Martini, silicet rex Franci, est canonicus de consududine et habet parvum prebendum quem habet sanctus venantius, et debet sed in seed the sorarii. It is asserted that after that epoch the archdeacon had frequent conferences with Louis Roman XI, when His Majesty came to Paris, and that Dom Claude's influence quite overshadowed that of Olivier le Dame and Jacques Coictier, who, as was his habit, rudely took the king to task on that account. Chapter Roman II, this will kill that. Our lady readers will pardon us if we pause for a moment to seek what could have been the thought concealed beneath those enigmatic words of the archdeacon, this will kill that, the book will kill the edifice. To our mind this thought had 2 faces. In the first place it was a priestly thought. It was the affright of the priest in the presence of a new agent, the printing press. It was the terror and dazzled amazement of the men of the sanctuary, in the presence of the luminous press of Gutenberg. It was the pulpit and the manuscript taking the alarm at the printed word, something similar to the stupor of a sparrow which should behold the angel legend unfold his 6,000,000 wings. It was the cry of the prophet who already hears emancipated humanity roaring and swarming, who beholds in the future intelligence sapping faith, opinion dethroning belief, the world shaking off Rome. It was the prognostication of the philosopher who sees human thought, volatilized by the press, evaporating from the theocratic recipient. It was the terror of the soldier who examines the brazen battering ram and says, the tower will crumble. It signified that one power was about to succeed another power. It meant the press will kill the church. But underlying this thought, the first and most simple one, no doubt, there was in our opinion another, newer one, a corollary of the first, less easy to perceive and more easy to contest, a view as philosophical and belonging no longer to the priest alone, but to the savant and the artist. It was a presentiment that human thought, in changing its form, was about to change its mode of expression. That the dominant idea of each generation would no longer be written with the same matter and in the same manner, that the book of stone, so solid and so durable, was about to make way for the book of paper, more solid and still more durable. In this connection, the archdeacon's vague formula had a second sense. It meant, printing will kill architecture. In fact, from the origin of things down to the 15th century of the Christian era, inclusive architecture is the great book of humanity, the principal expression of man in his different stages of development, either as a force or as an intelligence. When the memory of the first races felt itself overloaded, when the mass of reminiscences of the human race became so heavy and so confused that speech naked and flying ran the risk of losing them on the way, men transcribed them on the soil in a manner which was at once the most visible, most durable, and most natural. They sealed each tradition beneath a monument. The first monuments were simple masses of rock, which the iron had not touched, as Moses says. Architecture began like all writing. It was first an alphabet. Men planted a stone upright, it was a letter, and each letter was a hieroglyph, and upon each hieroglyph rested a group of ideas like the capital and the column. This is what the earliest races did everywhere at the same moment on the surface of the entire world. We find the standing stones of the Celts in Asian Siberia, in the pampas of America. Later on they made words, they placed stone upon stone, they coupled those syllables of granite and attempted some combinations. The Celtic dolmen and cromlech, the Etruscan tumulus, the Hebrew galgal are words. Some, especially the tumulus, are proper names. Sometimes even when men had a great deal of stone and a vast plain, they wrote a phrase. The immense pile of Karnak is a complete sentence. At last they made books. Traditions had brought forth symbols, beneath which they disappeared like the trunk of a tree beneath its foliage. All these symbols in which humanity placed faith continued to grow, to multiply, to intersect, to become more and more complicated. The first monuments no longer sufficed to contain them, they were overflowing in every part. These monuments hardly expressed now the primitive tradition, simple like themselves. Naked and prone upon the earth, the symbol felt the need of expansion in the edifice. Then architecture was developed in proportion with human thought. It became a giant with 1,000 heads and 1,000 arms, and fixed all this floating symbolism in an eternal, visible, palpable form. Daedalus, whose force measured, while Orpheus, whose intelligence sang. The pillar, which is a letter, the arcade, which is a syllable, the pyramid, which is a word, all set in movement at once by a law of geometry and by a law of poetry, grouped themselves, combined, amalgamated, descended, ascended, placed themselves side by side on the soil, ranged themselves in stories in the sky, until they had written under the dictation of the general idea of an epoch. Those marvelous books which were also marvelous edifices, the pagoda of Eklinga, the Ramsayan of Egypt, the temple of Solomon. The generating idea, the word, was not only at the foundation of all these edifices, but also in the form. The Temple of Solomon, for example, was not alone the binding of the Holy Book, it was the Holy Book itself. On each one of its concentric walls, the priests could read the word translated and manifested to the eye, and thus they followed its transformations from sanctuary to sanctuary, until they seized it in its last tabernacle. Under its most concrete form, which still belonged to architecture, the arch, thus the word was enclosed in an edifice, but its image was upon its envelope like the human form on the coffin of a mummy. And not only the form of edifices, but the site selected for them, revealed the thought which they represented, according as the symbol to be expressed was graceful or grave. Greece crowned her mountains with a temple harmonious to the eye. India disemboweled hers, to chisel therein those monstrous subterranean pagodas, borne up by gigantic rows of granite elephants. Thus, during the first 6,000 years of the world, from the most immemorial pagoda of Hindustan to the Cathedral of Cologne, architecture was the great handwriting of the human race. And this is so true that not only every religious symbol, but every human thought has its page and its monument in that immense book. All civilization begins in theocracy and ends in democracy. This law of liberty following unity is written in architecture. For let us insist upon this point, masonry must not be thought to be powerful only in erecting the temple and in expressing the myth and sacerdotal symbolism, in inscribing in hieroglyphs upon its pages of stone the mysterious tables of the law, if it were thus. As there comes in all human society a moment when the sacred symbol is worn out and becomes obliterated under freedom of thought, when man escapes from the priest, when the excrescence of philosophies and systems devour the face of religion, architecture could not reproduce this new state of human thought. Its leaves, so crowded on the face, would be empty on the back, its work would be mutilated, its book would be incomplete. But no. Let us take as an example the Middle Ages, where we see more clearly because it is nearer to us. During its first period, while theocracy is organizing Europe, while the Vatican is rallying and reclassing about itself, the elements of a Rome made from the Rome which lies in ruins around the capital, while Christianity is seeking all the stages of society amid the rubbish of interior civilization, and rebuilding with its ruins a new hierarchic universe, the keystone to whose vault is the priest one first hears a dull echo from that chaos, and then little by little, one sees arising from beneath the breath of Christianity, from beneath the hand of the barbarians, from the fragments of the dead Greek and Roman architectures, that mysterious Romanesque architecture, sister of the theocratic masonry of Egypt and of India, inalterable emblem of pure Catholicism, unchangeable hieroglyph of the papal unity. All the thought of that day is written, in fact, in this somber, Romanesque style. One feels everywhere in it authority, unity, the impenetrable, the absolute, Gregory Roman 7. Always the priest, never the man, everywhere caste, never the people. But the Crusades arrive. They are a great popular movement, and every great popular movement, whatever may be its cause and object, always sets free the spirit of liberty from its final precipitate. New things spring into life every day. Here opens the stormy period of the Jacuries, Pregries, and Leagues. Authority wavers, unity is divided. Feudalism demands to share with theocracy, while awaiting the inevitable arrival of the people. Who will assume the part of the lion, quia nominer leo? Seigneury pierces through sacerdotalism, the commonality through seigneury. The face of Europe is changed. Well, the face of architecture is changed also. Like civilization, it has turned a page, and the new spirit of the time finds her ready to write at its dictation. It returns from the Crusades with the pointed arch, like the nations with liberty. Then, while Rome is undergoing gradual dismemberment, Romanesque architecture dies. The hieroglyph deserts the cathedral and betakes itself to blazoning the donjon keep in order to lend prestige to feudalism. The cathedral itself, that edifice formerly so dogmatic, invaded henceforth by the bourgeoisie, by the community, by liberty, escapes the priest and falls into the power of the artist. The artist builds it after his own fashion. Farewell to mystery, myth. Law, fancy, and caprice welcome. Provided the priest has his basilica and his altar, he has nothing to say. The four walls belong to the artist. The architectural book belongs no longer to the priest, to religion, to Rome. It is the property of poetry, of imagination, of the people. Hence the rapid and innumerable transformations of that architecture which owns but 3 centuries, so striking after the stagnant immobility of the Romanesque architecture, which owns 6 or 7. Nevertheless, art marches on with giant strides. Popular genius amid originality accomplished the task which the bishops formerly fulfilled. Each race writes its line upon the book as it passes. It erases the ancient Romanesque hieroglyphs on the frontispieces of cathedrals, and at the most one only sees dogma cropping out here and there, beneath the new symbol which it has deposited. The popular drapery hardly permits the religious skeleton to be suspected. One cannot even form an idea of the liberties which the architects then take, even toward the church. There are capitals knitted of nuns and monks, shamelessly coupled, as on the hall of chimney pieces in the Palais de Justice in Paris. There is Noah's adventure carved to the last detail, as under the great portal of Bourges. There is a bacchanalian monk with ass's ears and glass in hand, laughing in the face of a whole community, as on the lavatory of the Abbey of Botcherville. There exists at that epoch, for thought written in stone, a privilege exactly comparable to our present liberty of the press. It is the liberty of architecture. This liberty goes very far. Sometimes a portal, a facade, an entire church presents a symbolical sense absolutely foreign to worship, or even hostile to the church. In the 13th century, Guillaume de Paris and Nicolas Flamel, in the 15th, wrote such seditious pages. Saint Jacques de la Boucherie was a whole church of the opposition. Thought was then free only in this manner, hence it never wrote itself out completely except on the books called edifices. Thought, under the form of edifice, could have beheld itself burned in the public square by the hands of the executioner, in its manuscript form, if it had been sufficiently imprudent to risk itself thus. Thought, as the door of a church, would have been a spectator of the punishment of thought as a book, having thus only this resource, masonry. In order to make its way to the light, flung itself upon it from all quarters. Hence the immense quantity of cathedrals which have covered Europe, a number so prodigious that one can hardly believe it even after having verified it. All the material forces, all the intellectual forces of society converged towards the same point, architecture. In this manner, under the pretext of building churches to God, art was developed in its magnificent proportions. Then whoever was born a poet became an architect. Genius, scattered in the masses, repressed in every quarter under feudalism as under a testudo of brazen bucklers, finding no issue except in the direction of architecture, gushed forth through that art, and its Iliads assumed the form of cathedrals. All other arts obeyed and placed themselves under the discipline of architecture. They were the workmen of the great work, the architect, the poet, the master. Summed up in his person the sculpture which carved his facades, painting which illuminated his windows, music which set his bells to pealing and breathed into his organs. There was nothing down to poor poetry, properly speaking, that which persisted in vegetating in manuscript, which was not forced, in order to make something of itself, to come and frame itself in the edifice in the shape of a hymn or of prose. The same part, after all, which the tragedies of Aeschylus had played in the sacerdotal festivals of Greece, Genesis in the temple of Solomon. Thus down to the time of Gutenberg, architecture is the principal writing, the universal writing. In that granite book begun by the Orient, continued by Greek and Roman antiquity, the Middle Ages wrote the last page. Moreover, this phenomenon of an architecture of the people following an architecture of caste, which we have just been observing in the Middle Ages, is reproduced with every analogous movement in the human intelligence at the other great epochs of history. Thus, in order to enunciate here only summarily, a law which it would require volumes to develop, in the High Orient, the cradle of primitive times, after Hindu architecture came Phoenician architecture, that opulent mother of Arabian architecture. In antiquity, after Egyptian architecture, of which Etruscan style and Cyclopean monuments are but one variety, came Greek architecture, of which the Roman style is only a continuation. Surcharged with the Carthaginian dome, in modern times, after Romanesque architecture came Gothic architecture. And by separating their three series into their component parts, we shall find in the three eldest sisters, Hindu architecture, Egyptian architecture, Romanesque architecture, the same symbol. That is to say, theocracy, caste, unity, dogma, myth, God. And for the three younger sisters, Phoenician architecture, Greek architecture, Gothic architecture, whatever nevertheless may be the diversity of form inherent in their nature, the same signification also, that is to say, liberty, the people, man. In the Hindu, Egyptian, or Romanesque architecture, one feels the priest, nothing but the priest, whether he calls himself Brahmin, Magin, or Pope. It is not the same in the architectures of the people. They are richer and less sacred. In the Phoenician, one feels the merchant, in the Greek, the republican, in the Gothic, the citizen. The general characteristics of all theocratic architecture are immutability, horror of progress, the preservation of traditional lines, the consecration of the primitive types, the constant bending of all the forms of men and of nature to the incomprehensible caprices of the symbol. These are dark books which the initiated alone understand how to decipher. Moreover, every form, every deformity even, has there a sense which renders it inviolable. Do not ask of Hindu, Egyptian, Romanesque masonry to reform their design or to improve their statuary. Every attempt at perfecting is an impiety to them. In these architectures, it seems as though the rigidity of the dogma had spread over the stone like a sort of second petrifaction. The general characteristics of popular masonry, on the contrary, are progress, originality, opulence, perpetual movement. They are already sufficiently detached from religion to think of their beauty, to take care of it, to correct without relaxation their parure of statues or arabesques. They are of the age. They have something human which they mingle incessantly with the divine symbol under which they still produce. Hence, edifices comprehensible to every soul, to every intelligence, to every imagination, symbolical still, but as easy to understand as nature. Between theocratic architecture and this, there is the difference that lies between a sacred language and a vulgar language, between hieroglyphics and art, between Solomon and Phidias. If the reader will sum up what we have hitherto briefly, very briefly indicated, neglecting 1,000 proofs and also 1,000 objections of detail, he will be led to this: that architecture was, down to the 15th century, the chief register of humanity, that in that interval not a thought which is in any degree complicated made its appearance in the world which has not been worked into an edifice, that every popular idea and every religious law has had its monumental records, that the human race has, in short, had no important thought which it has not written in stone. And why? Because every thought, either philosophical or religious, is interested in perpetuating itself, because the idea which has moved one generation wishes to move others also and leave a trace. Now, what a precarious immortality is that of the manuscript! How much more solid, durable, unyielding is a book of stone! In order to destroy the written word, a torch and a Turk are sufficient. To demolish the constructed word, a social revolution, a terrestrial revolution are required. The barbarians passed over the Colosseum, the deluge perhaps passed over the pyramids. In the 15th century, everything changes. Human thought discovers a mode of perpetuating itself, not only more durable and more resisting than architecture, but still more simple and easy. Architecture is dethroned. Gutenberg's letters of light are about to supersede Orpheus's letters of stone. The book is about to kill the edifice. The invention of printing is the greatest event in history. It is the mother of revolution. It is the mode of expression of humanity which is totally renewed. It is human thought stripping off one form and donning another. It is the complete and definitive change of skin of that symbolical serpent which since the days of Adam has represented intelligence. In its printed form, thought is more imperishable than ever. It is volatile, irresistible, indestructible. It is mingled with the air. In the days of architecture, it made a mountain of itself and took powerful possession of a century and a place. Now it converts itself into a flock of birds, scatters itself to the four winds, and occupies all points of air and space at once. We repeat, who does not perceive that in this form it is far more indelible? It was solid, it has become alive. It passes from duration in time to immortality. One can demolish a mass, how can one extirpate ubiquity? If a flood comes, the mountains will have long disappeared beneath the waves, while the birds will still be flying about. And if a single ark floats on the surface of the cataclysm, they will alight upon it, will float with it, will be present with it at the ebbing of the waters, and the new world which emerges from this chaos will behold, on its awakening, the thought of the world which has been submerged soaring above it, winged and living. And when one observes that this mode of expression is not only the most conservative, but also the most simple, the most convenient, the most practicable for all, when one reflects that it does not drag after it bulky baggage and does not set in motion a heavy apparatus, when one compares thought forced in order to transform itself into an edifice, to put in motion 4 or 5 other arts and tons of gold, a whole mountain of stones, a whole forest of timber work, a whole nation of workmen, when one compares it to the thought which becomes a book, and for which a little paper, a little ink, and a pen suffice, how can one be surprised that human intelligence should have quitted architecture for printing? Cut the primitive bed of a river abruptly with a canal hollowed out below its level, and the river will desert its bed. Behold how, beginning with the discovery of printing, architecture withers away little by little, becomes lifeless and bare. How one feels the water sinking, the sap departing, the thought of the times and of the people withdrawing from it. The chill is almost imperceptible in the 15th century. The press is as yet too weak, and at the most draws from powerful architecture a superabundance of life, but practically beginning with the 16th century. The malady of architecture is visible. It is no longer the expression of society. It becomes classic art in a miserable manner. From being Gallic, European, indigenous, it becomes Greek and Roman. From being true and modern, it becomes pseudo-classic. It is this decadence which is called the Renaissance. A magnificent decadence, however, for the ancient Gothic genius, that sun which sets behind the gigantic press of Mayence, still penetrates for a while longer with its rays that whole hybrid pile of Latin arcades and Corinthian columns. It is that setting sun which we mistake for the dawn. Nevertheless, from the moment when architecture is no longer anything but an art like any other, as soon as it is no longer the total art, the sovereign art, the tyrant art, it has no longer the power to retain the other arts. So they emancipate themselves, break the yoke of the architect, and take themselves off, each one in its own direction. Each one of them gains by this divorce. Isolation aggrandizes everything. Sculpture becomes statuary. The image trade becomes painting. The canon becomes music. One would pronounce it an empire dismembered at the death of its Alexander, and whose provinces become kingdoms. Hence Raphael, Michelangelo, Jean Gauguin, Palestrina, those splendors of the dazzling 16th century. Thought emancipates itself in all directions at the same time as the arts. The arch-heretics of the Middle Ages had already made large incisions into Catholicism. The 16th century breaks religious unity. Before the invention of printing, reform would have been merely a schism. Printing converted it into a revolution. Take away the press, heresy is enervated. Whether it be Providence or fate, Gutenberg is the precursor of Luther. Nevertheless, when the sun of the Middle Ages is completely set, when the Gothic genius is forever extinct upon the horizon, architecture grows dim, loses its color, becomes more and more effaced. The printed book, the gnawing worm of the edifice, sucks and devours it. It becomes bare, denuded of its foliage, and grows visibly emaciated. It is petty, it is poor, it is nothing. It no longer expresses anything, not even the memory of the art of another time. Reduced to itself, abandoned by the other arts because human thought is abandoning it, it summons bunglers in place of artists. Glass replaces the painted windows. The stonecutter succeeds the sculptor. Farewell all sap, all originality, all life, all intelligence. It drags along, a lamentable workshop mendicant from copy to copy. Michelangelo, who, no doubt, felt even in the 16th century that it was dying, had a last idea, an idea of despair. That titan of art piled the Pantheon on the Parthenon and made St. Peter's at Rome. A great work which deserved to remain unique, the last originality of architecture, the signature of a giant artist at the bottom of the colossal register of stone which was closed forever. With Michelangelo dead, what does this miserable architecture, which survived itself in the state of a spectre, do? It takes St. Peter in Rome, copies it, and parodies it. It is a mania. It is a pity. Each century has its St. Peter's of Rome. In the 17th century, the Val de Grace. In the 18th, St. Genevieve. Each country has its St. Peter's of Rome. London has one, Petersburg has another, Paris has 2 or 3. The insignificant testament, the last dotage of a decrepit grand art falling back into infancy before it dies. If in place of the characteristic monuments which we have just described, we examine the general aspect of art from the 16th to the 18th century, we notice the same phenomena of decay and phthisis. Beginning with Francois Roman II, the architectural form of the edifice effaces itself more and more, and allows the geometrical form, like the bony structure of an emaciated invalid, to become prominent. The fine lines of art give way to the cold and inexorable lines of geometry. An edifice is no longer an edifice, it is a polyhedron. Meanwhile, architecture is tormented in her struggles to conceal this nudity. Look at the Greek pediment inscribed upon the Roman pediment and vice versa. It is still the Pantheon on the Parthenon, St. Peter's of Rome. Here are the brick houses of Henry Roman IV, with their stone corners, the Place Royale, the Place Dauphine. Here are the churches of Louis Roman XIII, heavy, squat, thick-set, crowded together, loaded with a dome like a hump. Here is the Mazarin architecture, the wretched Italian pasticcio of the Four Nations. Here are the palaces of Louis Roman XIV, long barracks for courtiers, stiff, cold, tiresome. Here, finally, is Louis Roman XV, with chicory leaves and vermicelli and all the warts and all the fungi which disfigure that decrepit, toothless, and coquettish old architecture. From Francois Roman II to Louis Roman XV, the evil has increased in geometrical progression. Art has no longer anything but skin upon its bones. It is miserably perishing. Meanwhile, what becomes of printing? All the life which is leaving architecture comes to it. In proportion as architecture ebbs, printing swells and grows. That capital of forces which human thought had been expending in edifices, it henceforth expends in books. Thus, from the 16th century onward, the price, raised to the level of decaying architecture, contends with it and kills it. In the 17th century, it is already sufficiently the sovereign, sufficiently triumphant, sufficiently established in its victory, to give to the world the feast of a great literary century. In the 18th, having reposed for a long time at the court of Louis Roman XIV, it seizes again the old sword of Luther, puts it into the hand of Voltaire, and rushes impetuously to the attack of that ancient Europe, whose architectural expression it has already killed. At the moment when the 18th century comes to an end, it has destroyed everything. In the 19th, it begins to reconstruct. Now we ask which of the three arts has really represented human thought for the last 3 centuries, which translates it, which expresses not only its literary and scholastic vagaries, but its vast, profound, universal movement, which constantly superposes itself, without a break, without a gap, upon the human race, which walks a monster with 1,000 legs, architecture or printing. It is printing, let the reader make no mistake. Architecture is dead, irretrievably slain by the printed book, slain because it endures for a shorter time, slain because it costs more. Every cathedral represents millions. Let the reader now imagine what an investment of funds it would require to rewrite the architectural book, to cause thousands of edifices to swarm once more upon the soil, to return to those epochs when the throng of monuments was such. According to the statement of an eyewitness, that one would have said that the world, in shaking itself, had cast off its old garments in order to cover itself with a white vesture of churches. Erat inimut si mundus, ips excutiondo semit, rejecta verstate, candidum ecclesiarum vestum indurit, gleba Radolphus. A book is so soon made, costs so little, and can go so far. How can it surprise us that all human thought flows in this channel? This does not mean that architecture will not still have a fine monument, an isolated masterpiece here and there. We may still have from time to time, under the reign of printing, a column made, I suppose, by a whole army from melted cannon, as we had under the reign of architecture, Iliads and Romanceros, Mahabharata. And Nibelungen lieds made by a whole people, with rhapsodies piled up and melted together. The great accident of an architect of genius may happen in the 20th century, like that of Dante in the 13th. But architecture will no longer be the social art, the collective art, the dominating art. The grand poem, the grand edifice, the grand work of humanity will no longer be built, it will be printed. And henceforth, if architecture should arise again accidentally, it will no longer be mistress. It will be subservient to the law of literature, which formerly received the law from it. The respective positions of the two arts will be inverted. It is certain that in architectural epochs the poems, rare it is true, resemble the monuments. In India, Vyasa is branching, strange, impenetrable as a pagoda. In Egyptian Orient, poetry has like the edifices. Grandeur and tranquility of line. In antique Greece, beauty, serenity, calm. In Christian Europe, the Catholic majesty, the popular naivete, the rich and luxuriant vegetation of an epoch of renewal. The Bible resembles the pyramids, the Iliad, the Parthenon, Homer, Phidias. Dante in the 13th century is the last Romanesque church, Shakespeare in the 16th, the last Gothic cathedral. Thus, to sum up what we have hitherto said, in a fashion which is necessarily incomplete and mutilated, the human race has 2 books, 2 registers, 2 testaments, masonry and printing, the Bible of stone and the Bible of paper. No doubt, when one contemplates these 2 Bibles laid so broadly open in the centuries, it is permissible to regret the visible majesty of the writing of granite, those gigantic alphabets formulated in colonnades and pylons. In obelisks, those sorts of human mountains which cover the world and the past, from the pyramid to the bell tower, from Cheops to Strasbourg. The past must be reread upon these pages of marble. This book, written by architecture, must be admired and perused incessantly. but the grandeur of the edifice which printing erects in its turn must not be denied. That edifice is colossal. Some compiler of statistics has calculated that if all the volumes which have issued from the press since Gutenberg's day were to be piled one upon another, they would fill the space between the earth and the moon, but it is not that sort of grandeur of which we wish to speak. Nevertheless, when one tries to collect in one's mind a comprehensive image of the total products of printing down to our own days, does not that total appear to us like an immense construction, resting upon the entire world at which humanity toils without relaxation, and whose monstrous crest is lost in the profound mists of the future? It is the anthill of intelligence. It is the hive whither come all imaginations, those golden bees with their honey. The edifice has 1,000 stories. Here and there one beholds on its staircases the gloomy caverns of science which pierce its interior. Everywhere upon its surface, art causes its arabesques, rosettes, and laces to thrive luxuriantly before the eyes. There every individual work, however capricious and isolated it may seem, has its place and its projection. Harmony results from the whole, from the cathedral of Shakespeare to the mosque of Byron. 1,000 tiny bell towers are piled pell-mell above this metropolis of universal thought. At its base are written some ancient titles of humanity which architecture had not registered. To the left of the entrance has been fixed the ancient bas-relief in white marble of Homer. To the right, the polyglot Bible rears its 7 heads. The Hydra of the Romancero and some other hybrid forms, the Vedas and the Nibelungen, bristle further on. Nevertheless, the prodigious edifice still remains incomplete. The press, that giant machine which incessantly pumps all the intellectual sap of society, belches forth without pause fresh materials for its work. The whole human race is on the scaffoldings. Each mind is a mason. The humblest fills his hole or places his stone. Radif de la Bretonne brings his hod of plaster. Every day a new course rises. Independently of the original and individual contribution of each writer, there are collective contingents. The 18th century gives the encyclopedia, the Revolution gives the moniteur. Assuredly, it is a construction which increases and piles up in endless spirals. There also are confusion of tongues, incessant activity, indefatigable labor, eager competition of all humanity, refuge promised to intelligence, a new flood against an overflow of barbarians. It is the second Tower of Babel of the human race. Book 6. Chapter I. An impartial glance at the ancient magistracy. A very happy personage in the year of grace 1482, was the noble gentleman Robert d'Estouteville, Chevalier, Sieur de Bain, Baron d'Ivry and Saint Andrien-la-Marche, councillor and chamberlain to the king, and guard of the provostship of Paris. It was already nearly 17 years since he had received from the king, on November 7, 1465, the comet year 27, that fine charge of the provostship of Paris, which was reputed rather a seigneury than an office. Dignitas, says Joannes Lomnois, qui cum non exiguo pot state policium concernent, ac prerogativis multis et juribus conjuncta est. A marvelous thing in 82 was a gentleman bearing the king's commission, and whose letters of institution ran back to the epoch of the marriage of the natural daughter of Louis Roman XI, with Monsieur the Bastard of Bourbon. Same day on which Robert d'Estouteville took the place of Jacques de Villiers in the provostship of Paris, Master Jehan Dovet replaced Messire Heli de Thoretz in the first presidency of the Court of Parliament. Jehan Juvenal des Ursins supplanted Pierre de Morvilliers in the office of Chancellor of France. Rignault des Dormans ousted Pierre Pie from the charge of Master of Requests in ordinary of the king's household. Now, upon how many heads had the presidency, the chancellorship, the mastership passed since Robert d'Estouteville had held the provostship of Paris? It had been granted to him for safekeeping, as the letters patent said, and certainly he kept it well. He had clung to it, he had incorporated himself with it, he had so identified himself with it that he had escaped that fury for change which possessed Louis Roman XI, a tormenting and industrious king, whose policy it was to maintain the elasticity of his power by frequent appointments and revocations. More than this, the brave Chevalier had obtained the reversion of the office for his son, and for 2 years already the name of the noble man Jacques d'Estouteville, equerry, had figured beside his at the head of the register of the salary list of the provostship of Paris. A rare and notable favor indeed. It is true that Robert d'Estouteville was a good soldier, that he had loyally raised his pennon against the leg of public good, and that he had presented to the queen a very marvelous stag and confectionery on the day of her entrance to Paris in 14. Moreover, he possessed the good friendship of Messire Tristan el Hermite, provost of the marshals of the king's household. Hence a very sweet and pleasant existence was that of Messire Robert. In the first place, very good wages, to which were attached, and from which hung like extra bunches of grapes on his vine, the revenues of the civil and criminal registries of the provostship, plus the civil and criminal revenues of the tribunals of Embaz of the Chatelet, without reckoning some little toll from the bridges of Mantes and of Corbeil, and the profits on the craft of chagrin makers of Paris, on the quarters of firewood and the measures of salt. Add to this the pleasure of displaying himself in rides about the city, and of making his fine military costume, which you may still admire sculptured on his tomb in the Abbey of Valmont in Normandy, and his morion, all embossed at Montlhéry, stand out a contrast against the party-colored red and tawny robes of the aldermen and police. And then was it nothing to wield absolute supremacy over the sergeants of the police, the porter and watch of the chatelet, the 2 auditors of the chatelet, auditors Casaletti, the 16 commissioners of the 16 quarters, the jailer of the chatelet, the 4 and fief sergeants, the 120 mounted sergeants, with maces, the chevalier of the watch with his watch, his sub-watch, his counter-watch, and his rear-watch? Was it nothing to exercise high and low justice? The right to interrogate, to hang, and to draw, without reckoning petty jurisdiction in the first resort, in prima instantia, as the charters say, on that Viscounty of Paris, so nobly appanaged with 7 noble bailiwicks. Can anything sweeter be imagined than rendering judgments and decisions, as Messire Robert d'Estouteville daily did in the grand chatelet, under the large and flattened arches of Philip Augustus? And going, as he was wont to do every evening, to that charming house situated in the Rue Galilée, in the enclosure of the royal palace, which he held in right of his wife, Madame Ambroise de Lorey, to repose after the fatigue of having sent some poor wretch to pass the night in that little cell of the Rue de Escorcherie, which the provosts and aldermen of Paris used to make their prison, the same being 11 feet long, 7 feet and 4 inches wide, and 11 feet high, 28. Not only had Messire Robert d'Estouteville his special court as Provost and Vicomte of Paris, but in addition he had a share both for eye and tooth in the grand court of the king. There was no head in the least elevated which had not passed through his hands before it came to the headsman. It was he who went to seek M. de Nemers at the Bastille Saint-Antoine in order to conduct him to the Halles, and to conduct to the Greve M. de Saint-Paul, who clamored and resisted, to the great joy of the provost, who did not love Monsieur the Constable. Here assuredly is more than sufficient to render a life happy and illustrious, and to deserve some day a noble page in that interesting history of the provosts of Paris, where one learns that Outer de Villeneuve had a house in the Rue des Boucheries, that Guillaume de Hangest purchased the Great in the Little Savoy, that Guillaume Thibaus gave the nuns of Saint Genevieve his houses in the Rue Clopin, that Hugues Aubriot lived in the Hotel du Porc-Épic, and other domestic facts. Nevertheless, with so many reasons for taking life patiently and joyously, Messire Robert d'Estouteville woke up in the morning of the 7th of January, 1482, in a very surly and peevish mood. Whence came this ill temper, he could not have told himself. Was it because the sky was grey, or was the buckle of his old belt of Montlhéry badly fastened so that it confined his provostal portliness too closely? Had he beheld ribald fellows marching in bands of 4 beneath his window and setting him at defiance in doublets but no shirts, hats without crowns, with wallet and bottle at their side? Was it a vague presentiment of the 370 livres, 16 sous, 8 farthings, which the future King Charles Roman VII was to cut off from the provostship in the following year? The reader can take his choice. We, for our part, are much inclined to believe that he was in a bad humor, simply because he was in a bad humor. Moreover, it was the day after a festival, a tiresome day for everyone, and above all for the magistrate who is charged with sweeping away all the filth, properly and figuratively speaking, which a festival day produces in Paris. And then he had to hold a sitting at the Grand Chatelet. Now, we have noticed that judges in general so arrange matters that their day of audience shall also be their day of bad humor, so that they may always have someone upon whom to vent it conveniently, in the name of the king, law, and justice. However, the audience had begun without him. His lieutenants, civil, criminal, and private, were doing his work according to usage, and from 8 o'clock in the morning, some scores of bourgeois and bourgeoises, heaped and crowded into an obscure corner of the audience chamber of Ambaz du Chatelet, between a stout oaken barrier and the wall, had been gazing blissfully at the varied and cheerful spectacle of civil and criminal justice dispensed by Master Florian Barbedian, auditor of the Chatelet, lieutenant of Monsieur the Provost, in a somewhat confused and utterly haphazard manner. The hall was small, low, vaulted. A table studded with fleurs de lis stood at one end, with a large armchair of carved oak which belonged to the provost and was empty, and a stool on the left for the auditor, Master Florian. Below sat the clerk of the court, scribbling. Opposite was the populace, and in front of the door and in front of the table were many sergeants of the provostship in sleeveless jackets of violet camlet, with white crosses. 2 sergeants of the Parois bourgeois, clothed in their jackets of Toussaint, half red, half blue, were posted as sentinels before a low, closed door, which was visible at the extremity of the hall, behind the table. A single pointed window, narrowly encased in the thick wall, illuminated with a pale ray of January sun 2 grotesque figures, the capricious demon of stone carved as a tailpiece in the keystone of the vaulted ceiling, and the judge seated at the end of the hall on the fleurs de lis. Imagine, in fact, at the provost's table, leaning upon his elbows between two bundles of documents of cases, with his foot on the train of his robe of plain brown cloth, his face buried in his hood of white lamb skin, of which his brows seemed to be of a piece, red, crabbed, winking, bearing majestically the load of fat on his cheeks which met under his chin, Master Florian Barbedian, auditor of the chatelet. Now the auditor was deaf, a slight defect in an auditor. Master Florian delivered judgment none the less without appeal and very suitably. It is certainly quite sufficient for a judge to have the air of listening, and the venerable auditor fulfilled this condition, the sole one in justice, all the better because his attention could not be distracted by any noise. Moreover, he had in the audience a pitiless censor of his deeds and gestures, in the person of our friend Jehan Frollo du Moulin, that little student of yesterday, that stroller, whom one was sure of encountering all over Paris, anywhere except before the rostrums of the professors. "Stay," he said in a low tone to his companion Robin Pausapane, who was grinning at his side, while he was making his comments on the scenes which were being unfolded before his eyes. "Yonder is Jehanette du Buisson, the beautiful daughter of the lazy dog at the Marché Neuf. Upon my soul, he is condemning her, the old rascal. He has no more eyes than ears. 15 sous, 4 farthings, Parisian, for having worn 2 rosaries. 'Tis somewhat dear. Lex duri Carmines, who's that? Robin Chief de Ville, hauberk maker, for having been passed and received master of the said trade. That's his entrance money. He 2 gentlemen among these knaves. Aiglet de Soins, Houghton de Mailly, 2 equerries, Corpus Christi. Ah, they have been playing at dice. When shall I see our rector here? 100 livres Parisian, fine to the king. That Barbedian strikes like a deaf man, as he is. I'll be my brother the archdeacon if that keeps me from gaming by day, gaming by night, living at play, dying at play, and gaming away my soul after my shirt. Holy Virgin, what damsels, one after the other my lambs. Ambroise Lecaire, Sebala Painet, Berard Girenin. I know them all by heavens. A fine, that's what will teach you to wear gilded girdles. 10 sous parisis, you coquettes, oh. The old snout of a judge, deaf and imbecile, oh, Florian the dolt, oh, Barbedian the blockhead, there he is at the table. He's eating the plaintiff, he's eating the suits, he eats, he chews, he crams, he fills himself. Fines, lost goods, taxes, expenses, loyal charges, salaries, damages, and interest, Gehenna, prison and jail, and fetters with expenses are Christmas spice cake and marchpanes of St. John to him. Look at him, the pig come. Good, another amorous woman, Thibaud la Thibaud, neither more nor less, for having come from the Rue Gladigny. What fellow is this? Geoffroy Mabon, gendarme bearing the crossbow. He has cursed the name of the father. A fine for la Thibaud. A fine for Geoffroy, a fine for them both, the deaf old fool. He must have mixed up the 2 cases. 10 to 1 that he makes the wench pay for the oath and the gendarme for the amour. Attention, Robin Pausapane, what are they going to bring in? Here are many sergeants. By Jupiter, all the bloodhounds of the pack are there. It must be the great beast of the hunt, a wild boar. And 'tis one, Robin, 'tis one, and a fine one too, Hercule. 'Tis our prince of yesterday, our pope of the fools, our bellringer, our one-eyed man, our hunchback, our grimace. 'Tis Quasimodo. It was he, indeed. It was Quasimodo, bound, encircled, roped, pinioned, and under good guard. The squad of policemen who surrounded him was assisted by the Chevalier of the Watch in person, wearing the arms of France embroidered on his breast and the arms of the city on his back. There was nothing, however, about Quasimodo except his deformity which could justify the display of halberds and arquebuses. He was gloomy, silent, and tranquil. Only now and then did his single eye cast a sly and wrathful glance upon the bonds with which he was loaded. He cast the same glance about him, but it was so dull and slapy that the women only pointed him out to each other in derision. Meanwhile, Master Florian, the auditor, turned over attentively the document in the complaint entered against Quasimodo, which the clerk handed him, and having thus glanced at it, appeared to reflect for a moment. Thanks to this precaution, which he always was careful to take at the moment when on the point of beginning an examination, he knew beforehand the names, titles, and misdeeds of the accused, made cut and dried responses to questions first seen, and succeeded in extricating himself from all the windings of the interrogation without allowing his deafness to be too apparent. The written charges were to him what the dog is to the blind man. If his deafness did happen to betray him here and there, by some incoherent apostrophe or some unintelligible question, it passed for profundity with some, and for imbecility with others. In either case did the honor of the magistracy sustain any injury, for it is far better that a judge should be reputed imbecile or profound than deaf. Hence he took great care to conceal his deafness from the eyes of all, and he generally succeeded so well that he had reached the point of deluding himself, which is, by the way, easier than is supposed. All hunchbacks walk with their heads held high, all stutterers harangue, all deaf people speak low. As for him, he believed, at the most, that his ear was a little refractory. It was the sole concession which he made on this point to public opinion in his moments of frankness and examination of his conscience. Having then thoroughly ruminated Quasimodo's affair, he threw back his head and half closed his eyes, for the sake of more majesty and impartiality, so that, at that moment, he was both deaf and blind. A double condition, without which no judge is perfect. It was in this magisterial attitude that he began the examination. Your name. Now this was a case which had not been provided for by law, where a deaf man should be obliged to question a deaf man. Quasimodo, whom nothing warned their question had been addressed to him, continued to stare intently at the judge and made no reply. The judge, being deaf and being in no way warned of the deafness of the accused, thought that the latter had answered, as all accused do in general, and therefore he pursued with his mechanical and stupid self-possession. Very well, and your age? Again Quasimodo made no reply to this question. The judge supposed that it had been replied to, and continued. Now your profession. Still the same silence. The spectators had begun, meanwhile, to whisper together and to exchange glances. That will do, went on the imperturbable auditor, when he supposed that the accused had finished his third reply. You are accused before us, primo, of nocturnal disturbance, secundo, of a dishonorable act of violence upon the person of a foolish woman in prejudicium meretricis, tertio, of rebellion and disloyalty towards the archers of the police of our lord the king. Explain yourself upon all these points. Clerk. Have you written down what the prisoner has said thus far? At this unlucky question, a burst of laughter rose from the clerk's table, caught by the audience, so violent, so wild, so contagious, so universal, that the two deaf men were forced to perceive it. Quasimodo turned round, shrugging his hump with disdain, while Master Florian, equally astonished, and supposing that the laughter of the spectators had been provoked by some irreverent reply from the accused, rendered visible to him by that shrug of the shoulders, apostrophized him indignantly. You have uttered a reply, knave, which deserves the halter. Do you know to whom you are speaking? This sally was not fitted to arrest the explosion of general merriment. It struck all as so whimsical and so ridiculous that the wild laughter even attacked the sergeants of the parloyaux bourgeois, a sort of pikemen whose stupidity was part of their uniform. Quasimodo alone preserved his seriousness, for the good reason that he understood nothing of what was going on around him. The judge, more and more irritated, thought it his duty to continue in the same tone, hoping thereby to strike the accused with a terror which should react upon the audience and bring it back to respect. So this is as much as to say, perverse and thieving knave that you are, that you permit yourself to be lacking in respect towards the auditor of the Chatelet, to the magistrate committed to the popular police of Paris, charged with searching out crimes, delinquencies, and evil conduct, with controlling all trades and interdicting monopoly, with maintaining the pavements, with debarring the hucksters of chickens, poultry, and waterfowl, of superintending the measuring of faggots and other sorts of wood, of purging the city of mud and the air of contagious maladies, in a word, with attending continually to public affairs, without wages or hope of salary. Do you know that I am called Florian Barbedian, actual lieutenant to Monsieur the Provost, and moreover commissioner, inquisitor, controller, and examiner, with equal power in provostship, bailiwick, preservation, and inferior court of judicature? There is no reason why a deaf man talking to a deaf man should stop. God knows where and when Master Florian would have landed, when thus launched at full speed in lofty eloquence, if the low door at the extreme end of the room had not suddenly opened and given entrance to the Provost in person. At his entrance, Master Florian did not stop short, but making a half-turn on his heels, and aiming at the Provost the harangue with which he had been withering Quasimodo a moment before. Monseigneur, said he, I demand such penalty as you shall deem fitting against the prisoner here present, for grave and aggravated offense against the court. And he seated himself utterly breathless, wiping away the great drops of sweat which fell from his brow and drenched, like tears, the parchment spread out before him. Messire Robert d'Estouteville frowned and made a gesture so imperious and significant to Quasimodo that the deaf man in some measure understood it. The Provost addressed him with severity. What have you done that you have been brought hither, knave? The poor fellow, supposing that the Provost was asking his name, broke the silence which he habitually preserved, and replied in a harsh and guttural voice, Quasimodo. The reply matched the question so little that the wild laugh began to circulate once more, and Messire Robert exclaimed, red with wrath, Are you mocking me also, you arrant knave? Bellringer of Notre-Dame, replied Quasimodo, supposing that what was required of him was to explain to the judge who he was. Bellringer interpolated the provost, who had waked up early enough to be in a sufficiently bad temper, as we have said, not to require to have his fury inflamed by such strange responses. Bellringer, I'll play you a chime of rods on your back through the squares of Paris. Do you hear, knave? If it is my age that you wish to know, said Quasimodo, I think that I shall be 20 at St. Martin's Day. This was too much. The provost could no longer restrain himself. Ah, you are scoffing at the provostship, wretch. Messieurs the sergeants of the mace, you will take me this knave to the pillory of the Greve, you will flog him and turn him for an hour. He shall pay me for it, tertia, and I order that the present judgment shall be cried, with the assistance of 4 sworn trumpeters, in the 7 Castellanies of the Viscounty of Paris. The clerk set to work incontinently to draw up the account of the sentence.